There is a kind of silence that only very large houses know. Not the silence of emptiness, but something older than that. The silence of rooms where everything has already been decided, where the carpets are thick enough to swallow sound, where the furniture does not move, where the clocks have been winding themselves for 100 years. Imagine standing in such a house. The year is somewhere in the middle of the last century. The light is early morning light, pale gold, unhurried, coming in through windows that face east, across a lawn that has been green longer than anyone alive can remember. And somewhere in that house, a young man is sitting at a breakfast table set with silver and linen. He is looking out the window. He is thinking about leaving, not because he is unhappy exactly, but because he has begun to wonder what it would feel like to be useful. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. There is an old proverb, not American, though Americans like to think it is, that says a family's wealth moves from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The grandfather works with his hands and builds a fortune. The father inherits it and maintains it. The grandson inherits it and loses it, and the great-grandchildren start over. Different cultures say it differently. The Japanese say rice paddies to rice paddies in 3 generations. The Lancashire mill town said clogs to clogs in 3 generations. The Scottish said from the stable to the stars and back to the stable. The Spanish said father a merchant, son a gentleman, grandson a beggar. Everywhere human beings have accumulated wealth, they have noticed the same quiet law. What is built with effort rarely survives into the 3rd generation untouched. But this story is not about families who lost their fortunes to bad luck or bad investments or bad choices. This is a different kind of story altogether. This is the story of the sons and a few daughters who looked at what they had inherited and quietly, deliberately, sometimes secretly gave it all away. Not in fits of recklessness, not in bitterness, but in something more interesting than either of those things. In clarity. There is something that happens to certain people when they are born into old money, something that is hard to name precisely, but that you would recognize if you sat with them long enough. The houses of old money are quiet, not in the way that poor households are quiet from exhaustion, or that middle-class homes are quiet in the evening when everyone has run out of things to say. Old money quiet is a different thing. It is the quiet of surfaces, of rooms that look exactly the same as they did 15 years ago, of furniture arranged around the same fireplaces, the same paintings framed by the same light, the same silver on the same sideboard. The children who grow up in these houses learn first of all to be still, to sit at tables without fidgeting, to eat without excitement, to greet visitors with measured warmth, not warmth itself, to know which fork to use not because anyone explicitly told them, but because the possibility of not knowing was never permitted. They learn to carry themselves as though the weight of their name is something they were born knowing how to bear. And most of them do learn this. Most of them carry it well because the only alternative they can see is to drop it entirely, and that seems too dramatic, too rude. But some of them, and this is the thing that makes this story worth telling, some of them begin to feel, somewhere in their middle years, that the weight they are carrying is not their own. That they are carrying the accumulated decisions of people who are no longer alive. That the fortune, the house, the name, the position, all of it, is a kind of instruction, a set of expectations encoded into silver and stone and polished wood, and the instruction says, continue, preserve, maintain, pass on. And some of them, having heard this instruction their whole lives, finally find themselves wondering, what if I don't? What if I put it down? What would happen if I set all of this carefully, precisely in a pile on the floor, and walked out into the morning air without any of it? You may be wondering what it would actually feel like to carry that kind of fortune and choose to lay it down. The answer, for the men in this story, was more complicated and more quietly extraordinary than you might expect. Let us begin where most stories of inherited wealth begin, which is not at the beginning at all, but somewhere in the middle. Somewhere between the grandfather who built everything and the grandson who is sitting at the breakfast table, watching the early light cross the lawn, trying to remember the last time he felt genuinely tired. This is the thing about inherited wealth that is rarely said plainly. It can make genuine tiredness impossible to find. There is no work that must be done because the alternative is hunger. There is no struggle that cannot be softened by a phone call to a family solicitor, or the transfer of funds, or the purchase of a solution. The problems of old money are real problems. Loneliness, purposelessness, the strange vertigo of mattering to the world because of your name rather than anything you have done. But they are problems that look, from the outside, like no problems at all. And because they look like no problems, the sons and daughters of old money rarely have anyone to talk to about them. The friends they grew up with understand, but those friends have the same problems, and so they mostly talk about other things: the shooting season, the summer place, the arrangements being made for someone's wedding. Meanwhile, the actual feeling, or the hollow feeling, the feeling of being a cabinet someone has filled with good things but never opened, sits in the chest like something swallowed whole. There was a man, and we will return to him in more detail later, a grandson of one of America's great industrial fortunes, who described this feeling in a letter he wrote to a friend in 1952. He had just turned 40. He was sitting in his family's apartment in New York, looking out over a city that did not know his name, and feeling for the first time in his life the desire to go somewhere no one had ever heard of him. He wrote, "I have been thinking about what it would mean to be new, not to start over, I understand that's impossible, but simply to be new, to be unknown, to be the person who shows up and has to prove himself, not the person who shows up and has to justify the accident of his birth." He underlined that last phrase. The accident of his birth? Because that is what old money felt like to him. Not a gift, not a reward, an accident. Something that had happened to him rather than something he had earned, and therefore something that, in some deep and unspeakable way, did not fully belong to him. The breakfast table in the morning. The lawn going green all the way to the stone wall at the bottom. The family name carved above the fireplace in the library. None of it in the way that mattered was his. He had not made any of it, he had only received it. And receiving, he was discovering, was its own kind of poverty. There is a quiet way that old money families talk about themselves that is worth attending to. They do not, in general, talk about money. That would be vulgar. They talk about responsibility, about stewardship, about what is owed, not to the family name exactly, though that is implied, but to the world, to the idea of contributing, to the notion that privilege is not an entitlement but a weight, and that the correct response to the weight is to carry it gracefully and to use it carefully. These are good ideas. Many old money families have done genuinely good things with their fortunes, built libraries and hospitals and concert halls, funded schools and research, and the kinds of institutions that do not generate profit but generate something else, something harder to measure, something to do with the long, slow flourishing of a civilization. But there is another thing that happens in some families less often spoken about. There is a son who grows up in the house with the carved fireplace and the paintings and the silver, and who listens to all the talk of responsibility and stewardship, and who begins, quietly, to realize that the talk of stewardship is itself a kind of possession, that the fortune is being justified rather than questioned, that the conversation about what to do with wealth never quite opens the door onto the question of whether the wealth itself is right. And this son, this particular, restless, unusually honest son, begins to think differently. Not angrily, not bitterly. Quietly. The way you think when you have had years of silence and good furniture and early morning light, and nothing specific to do with the day, and you have run out of easier thoughts to think. He begins to think, what if the correct response to having been given too much is not to manage it carefully, but to give it away entirely? What if stewardship is just hoarding in more polished language? What if the fortune held on to does more harm to its holder than it does good to anyone else? These are old thoughts. They go back further than America, further even than the Gilded Age. They appear in the Gospels, in the Sermon on the Mount, the camel and the eye of the needle, the young man who asked what he must do, and was told to sell all he had and give it to the poor and went away sorrowful because he had great possessions. They appear in the Stoic philosophers, who held that nothing you have not earned through virtue belongs to you in any deep sense, and that the wise man holds external things lightly, knowing they can be taken. They appear in the great Russian writer Tolstoy, himself the inheritor of an aristocratic estate, himself the son of a family who had owned land and servants for generations, who eventually did something about these thoughts that shocked everyone around him. But we will come to Tolstoy. For now, the breakfast table, the early light, the lawn. And the young man sitting there, holding a silver spoon that has belonged to his family for longer than he has been alive, and thinking, with the particular thoughtfulness of someone who has had every advantage and is not sure what to do next, about putting it down. There is something worth pausing on here before we move deeper into the stories of these particular men. Something about what the fortune felt like from the inside. People who have not grown up with money tend to imagine that the experience of having a great deal of it is one of uninterrupted ease. And in a purely practical sense, of course, this is true. The heating works. The roof does not leak. When something breaks, someone comes to fix it. When you're hungry, the food is there. When you want to travel, you go. But inside that ease, there is something else. A kind of pressure that is hard to locate because it does not come from scarcity. It comes from the opposite of scarcity. When nothing is scarce, everything must be chosen, and choosing without the clarifying pressure of need is harder than it sounds. The sons of old money fortunes often describe in their letters and diaries and the rare candid interviews they give a feeling of floating, of being untethered from the ordinary current of consequence that moves most people through their days. They go to a good school because they go to a good school. They eat at fine restaurants because they eat at fine restaurants. They summer in the same place their family has always summered because that is where one summers. The days are full, the days are comfortable, but they do not feel in the way that matters earned. There is a specific word. Several people in this story used it independently in different decades and different contexts for this feeling. The word is useless. Not worthless precisely, not unimportant, not unhappy even, just useless, not needed, not necessary in any way that shows up in the world as a real, practical fact. You could remove these men from the world, and the world would continue exactly as before. The silver would still be on the sideboard, the lawn would still be green, the fortune would pass to the next person whose name was on the trust documents, and that person would sit at the breakfast table in the morning and look out at the lawn and feel the same things. You could remove them, and nothing would change. This is the thing that several of the men in this story eventually decided they could not bear. Not the lack of meaning exactly. Old money people find meaning, in art, in family, in the slow pleasures of a well-made life. But the lack of necessity, the sense that their presence or absence in the world made no particular difference to anything. There is a difference between being comfortable and being necessary, between being well-situated and being of use. And the men in this story at some point in their lives decided they could not continue to sit at the breakfast table being merely well-situated. They wanted to be of use. The question was how. The answer, for several of them, was more literal, more physical, more particular than anyone around them expected. They didn't just redirect their fortunes. They went to work. With their hands. Before we reach America, we should spend a moment in Russia. Because the most famous case of a man who inherited everything and gave it away, who did not merely redirect his fortune through lawyers and foundations, but who actually, physically, put on the clothes of a labourer and went to work, happened not in the American Gilded Age but in the Russian countryside in the second half of the 19th century, in the life of a man who is better known for his novels than for this particular choice. His name was Leo Tolstoy. He was born a count. His family owned an estate called Yasnaya Polyana, south of Moscow, where several hundred serfs, that is to say people legally bound to the land and to his family, worked the fields and lived in the village. He grew up in a world where his comfort and their labour were simply the arrangement of things, the way it had always been, the way it was understood to be. He went to university, though he did not finish. He served in the army and saw the Crimean War. He travelled to Western Europe and met the writers and thinkers of his day. He came home and wrote two of the greatest novels in human history. And then, in his 50s, after all of that, after the success, after the fame, after the fortune that the novels had added to the fortune he had inherited, something shifted. He began to work. Not to oversee work, not to manage, not to visit the fields occasionally and nod at the peasants with kindly condescension, but to actually work. He learned to plow. He learned to scythe. He learned to make boots, leather boots, working with his hands at a cobbler's last in his own study, with the same hands that had written War and Peace. He went out into the fields with the serfs and worked alongside them in the heat of summer. He chopped wood. He drew water. He dressed in the rough linen tunic and the high boots of a Russian peasant, and he wore them every day. His friends were appalled. His family was confused. His wife, Sophia, who had helped him copy his manuscripts by hand, and who loved him with the difficult, total love of a woman who's given her life to a man of genius, didn't understand and could not accept it. They argued about it for the rest of their lives. But Tolstoy was not doing it to be provocative. He was not making a point. He was doing it because he had arrived, after decades of thought, at the conclusion that the labour of his hands was the only honest currency he could offer the world. He had come to believe, and he wrote about this belief in essays that shook the foundations of polite Russian society, that wealth accumulated by those who do not labour is always, at some level, taken from those who do, that the comfortable life of the aristocrat is paid for invisibly by the discomfort of someone else, that the silk on the dining room table and the books in the library and the silver on the sideboard exist because someone, somewhere, did hard physical work and received very little in return. He gave away the rights to most of his writings. He refused royalties. He lived, as much as his complicated household allowed, on as little as possible. And he worked. Now, you may be wondering whether this was wisdom or madness, whether it was genuine renunciation or the gesture of a man so rich that poverty was still, for him, merely a costume. This is a fair question, and Tolstoy himself was not deaf to it. He knew that his peasant tunic did not make him a peasant. He knew that the estate was still there, the family was still there, the whole apparatus of privilege was still operating around him while he ploughed a field in homespun linen. But he believed, and this is the part that is worth holding, that the attempt mattered even when it was imperfect, that the gesture of reaching across the divide, of putting your body in proximity to the work you had previously only funded, changed something. Not in the world necessarily, but in the person. He kept a scythe and a saw leaning against the wall next to his writing desk. Not as symbols, not as decoration. As tools. As reminders that the hands can know things the mind cannot write. There is something in this that will appear again and again in the stories of the men we are telling tonight. This particular quality of hands-on knowledge. The discovery that manual work, real, physical, ordinary work, does something to a person that no amount of managing or funding or organising can do. It puts you in the world differently. When you're working with your hands, you're not floating above consequence. The thing you are making either holds together or it doesn't. The field is either ploughed or it isn't. The floor is either clean or it isn't. There is no ambiguity, no room for the comfortable fuzziness that comes from making decisions whose effects you will never personally see. And the men in this story, the ones who chose to set down the silver spoon and pick up a mop, or a wrench, or a shovel, many of them described this quality of manual work as something they had not expected to find. They had expected to find meaning, perhaps, or purpose. They had not expected to find simplicity. The feeling of a thing done that is genuinely done, a floor cleaned, a field turned, a machine fixed, not managed, not funded, not delegated, done with their own hands and visible and real. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to Russia for one more moment, because there is something else in the Tolstoy story that matters. After Tolstoy died, he died in 1910 at a small railway station, having left his estate in the middle of the night at the age of 82 to seek a quieter life, pursued by journalists confused and ill, and trying even at the end to be free of what he had been born into, and after he died, something happened that he had not entirely predicted. His ideas caught fire. Not his novels, which had already caught fire decades before, his ideas about renunciation, about voluntary simplicity, about the moral obligation of those who had too much to give it away and to do their own work. Communities sprang up across Russia and Europe and eventually in America. Communities of people, not all of them rich by any means, who wanted to live by the principle that labour was the only honest currency, and that what you could not make with your own hands, you should not have. They called themselves Tolstoyans. They built farms and grew food and educated their children, and tried to live without the accumulated apparatus of industrial civilization. Some of these communities lasted a few years, some lasted decades. Most of them struggled, because living by principle is genuinely hard, and the hardest part is not giving up the luxury, it is giving up the ease. The ease of buying what you need, the ease of delegating what is difficult, the ease of moving through the world with the assumption that your comfort is someone else's problem to solve. That particular ease, it turned out, was harder to renounce than any specific possession. But what matters for our story is this: the idea that a man of wealth and privilege could choose, genuinely choose, not in romantic gesture but in deliberate daily practice, to live and work as an ordinary person, was taken seriously by serious people. It travelled across decades, it crossed the Atlantic. It arrived in various forms in the lives of a handful of American sons of old money who had arrived, by different routes, at similar questions. And it is there, in those American lives, in those quieter and less famous acts of deliberate renunciation, that our main story lives. There is something almost calming about the sheer scale of what Tolstoy attempted, seen from this distance. Not because it succeeded exactly. His estate did not become a cooperative. His family did not live in poverty. His wife continued to own things. The whole apparatus of privilege did not dissolve simply because one man put on a linen tunic and learned to make boots. But because it was attempted. Because someone looked at the soft, comfortable, silk-covered arrangement of things and thought, "This is not right, and I am willing to say so with my body, not just with my words." There is a particular kind of courage in that. Not the courage of the battlefield, Tolstoy had that too, but a quieter courage. The courage of incongruity, of being visibly, deliberately, publicly wrong about what your name and your birth and your fortune say you should be. Of saying with your hands in the earth, "I do not accept the terms of my inheritance." This is the thing that connects Tolstoy to the Americans we will meet shortly, though they arrived at it differently, through different channels, from different starting places. They all at some point looked at the terms of their inheritance and decided to renegotiate. Some of them did it quietly, some of them did it in secret, some of them did it so carefully that the people around them, the business partners, the lawyers, the family members, did not know it had happened for years. But they all in their own way put down the silver spoon, and picked up something heavier and more honest. Before we leave Russia entirely, there is one more detail worth carrying forward into the night. Tolstoy's study at Yasnaya Polyana was a simple room. Not a grand library in the manner of English country houses, not a room designed to impress visitors with its collection of books. A simple room with a desk, with the manuscript on the desk, and against the wall, leaning there casually the way you might lean an umbrella in a hallway, the scythe. And the saw. Tools. In a study. Visitors noted them with confusion. What were they for? Why were they there? Tolstoy, when asked, said something that sounds simple but that takes a while to absorb. He said they were there because he did not want to forget. Did not want to forget what? The weight of things, the way a real tool feels in your hands, the fact that the world outside the window is not a view but a place where people worked. He did not want to forget that writing was one kind of work and ploughing was another, and that neither was more real than the other, and that a man who only did one had understood only half of what it meant to be in the world. The scythe against the wall. The saw. The manuscript on the desk. All of it in the same room in the same life. There is something restful about that image, actually. Something that settles, if you hold it for a moment. The idea that a life could contain all of those things, that you could think and write and also know the weight of a blade in your hands and the resistance of the earth. That you did not have to choose between the life of the mind and the life of the body. That the most honest life might be the one that holds both, a little awkwardly, in the same two hands. Let that rest for a moment. And when you are ready, we will move to America. We will move to a city in the 1930s, to a young man in a family that makes Tolstoy's aristocratic estate look modest, sitting at a different kind of breakfast table, looking out at a different kind of morning, beginning to think the same kind of thoughts. There is a particular way that old money houses smell. If you have been in one, you will know it. If you have not, it is difficult to describe without reducing it to its components, and the components are less than the whole. But it is something like beeswax polish and old wool, and the particular slightly musty richness of very old paper. The kind of smell that comes from rooms full of books that have not been opened in years. It is the smell of permanence, of things that have been here for a very long time, and intend to be here for a very long time more. The children who grow up in those houses absorb that smell the way they absorb everything else about the place, without noticing it, because it is simply the air. You do not notice the smell of your own home. It is only when you leave that you understand it was there. And the boys who grow up in those houses, the boys who are later in their 30s or 40s going to make the choices we have been discussing, carry that smell with them in a way they do not fully understand until much later, until they have slept in enough other kinds of rooms to know, by contrast, what their childhood rooms smelled like. The beeswax polish, the old paper, the wool, the permanence. This is the sensory dimension of the inheritance, not the money, which is abstract, but the houses, which are real and which shape the body in ways that last. Boys who grow up in large houses learn to move through space differently from boys who grow up in small ones. They develop, without thinking about it, a particular relationship to emptiness, to rooms that are not occupied, to the space between things. In a small house, space is scarce and occupied fully. Every room is used. Every surface has something on it. The relationship to space is one of mild competition. You and your brother and your parents are all negotiating the same, relatively limited territory. In a large house, the relationship to space is different. There are rooms you never enter. There are wings of the house that are opened only for guests. There are whole floors, the servants' floor, the old nursery, the room where grandfather's things are kept, that exist in a kind of suspended state, neither lived in nor entirely empty. The boy moves through this landscape and learns, without being taught, that the world is larger than what is in front of him, that there is always more space available, that the problem is not scarcity but selection, not having enough room, but choosing which rooms to inhabit. This is a way of relating to the world that, once established, is very difficult to unlearn. It is also, in its way, a preparation for the particular choices that the men in this story made. Because when you have grown up knowing that there are always more rooms, that the world is larger than what you are currently in, you can, if you choose, decide to inhabit smaller rooms. You can choose to reduce the space you take up. You can decide, as an act of deliberate intention, to be in a smaller room than the one that's available to you. This is not possible for someone who has never had the larger room. But for someone who has had it and knows what it feels like, the choice to inhabit the smaller room is a real choice, a meaningful one. And some of these men made it. Walked from the large house to the smaller room, and found, to their surprise and relief, that the smaller room felt more like home. This is the detail that is easy to miss in the simpler version of the story, the version where the rich man gives away his fortune and becomes humble, and humility is its own reward. The detail is this: the smaller room was not a sacrifice. It was a recognition. A recognition that the large house, for all its beauty and permanence and the particular smell of its air, had never been the right size. Not the right size for the person who was actually living in it. The large house was the right size for the family name, for the accumulated history, for the portrait in the hallway and the silver on the sideboard, and the arrangement of things that had been arranged before any of them were born, and would be arranged the same way when all of them were gone. The house was the right size for the history, but not for the man who happened to be living in the history at this particular moment. The man needed a smaller room. A room that was his. Not his by inheritance, his by choice. There is a very old understanding, present in one form or another in most contemplative traditions across the world, that the self contracts or expands to fill the space it is given. If you give a self too much space, too much unearned authority, too much arrangement, too much of the world organized to receive it, the self can spread too thin, can become more like a presence than a person, more like a name than a human being. And if you give a self less space, the right space, the space it actually needs, the space that requires it to be present to fill, the self can gather itself, can become denser, more real, more actually there. This is not a comfortable idea if you have spent your life in large houses. It suggests that the very abundance that was intended to nourish you may have thinned you. But it is also, in its way, encouraging, because it suggests that the remedy is not dramatic. You do not need to undergo a transformation. You do not need to become someone else. You simply need to find the right-sized room, and live in it, and let the self gather. The gospel of wealth, as Andrew Carnegie called it, argued that the surplus wealth of the rich was, in a sense, held in trust for the public good. Carnegie was one of the builders, one of the men who had, through the particular combination of intelligence and ruthlessness and good timing that the Gilded Age rewarded, accumulated an extraordinary amount of money, and he had, after accumulating it, done something interesting with it. He had written an essay about it. He had articulated, in plain language, a philosophy of what wealth was for. He argued that the man of wealth should live modestly, should provide decently for his dependents, and should consider everything beyond those needs as something to be distributed for the public good. He argued that the wealthy man who dies rich dies disgraced. He then spent the rest of his life distributing his fortune, and died in 1919, having given away $350 million, the equivalent of many billions in today's money, to libraries and universities and concert halls and research institutions across America and Britain. He died, by his own standard, not disgraced. But Carnegie's gospel, and this is the thing that links it to the stories we have been telling, was still a management gospel, still a gospel of the right arrangement of surplus, still a gospel in which the wealthy man remains at the top of the structure, deciding where the money goes, setting the terms of the gift, commissioning the buildings and naming them and watching them rise. The gospel of the men in this story was, in some ways, a different one. It was not the gospel of managed wealth. It was the gospel of useful hands. Tolstoy's hands learning to make boots. Winthrop's hands managing drill pipe in the Texas heat. The maintenance man's hands on the handle of the mop. The teacher's hands writing on the blackboard. These are hands in a different relationship to the world, not managing it from a position above it, in it, actually in it, doing the work that the world requires. There is a kind of pleasure in this that Carnegie's gospel could not quite reach. Carnegie knew the pleasure of building, the pleasure of seeing a library rise from a drawing to a foundation, to a building full of readers. This is real, and Carnegie felt it, and it was among the genuine satisfactions of his later years. But he never felt the pleasure of the roughneck, of managing your end of the drill pipe through a 12-hour shift in the Texas heat, and coming off the rig with the knowledge that the work was done, that you had been there, that you had been specifically necessary. That kind of pleasure requires the body. It requires showing up in the physical sense. It is not transferable by check, however large. And several of these men, the men who had the option of transferring by check and who chose instead to show up, were, in the end, looking for exactly that untransferable pleasure. The pleasure of being there. Of the hands. Of the work that is in the body, not just in the account. There is a very old word for this. In the Hebrew tradition, avodah. It means work, but it also means service, and in some uses, it also means worship. The word holds all three meanings simultaneously, because in the tradition that uses it, these three things are not separate. Work is service. Service is worship. The act of doing a thing that needs to be done with care, with the full attention of your body, this is not separate from the sacred. It is itself a form of the sacred. The clean floor. The well-made boot. The properly turned field. The child who understands something at the end of the lesson. These are not less than the great acts. They are the great acts, at the scale where greatness is actually visible. Tolstoy's scythe against the wall. The farmer's hands in the earth. The teacher's chalk on the board. All of it in the same life. All of it the same act of attention. You may be wondering, as the night deepens, what this has to do with you. With the life you are living, at the scale you are living it, with whatever combination of constraint and choice has brought you to this moment. And the answer is everything. Because the gospel of useful hands is not a gospel for the wealthy. It is a gospel for anyone who has ever felt the hollow feeling, the floating feeling, the sense of not quite being in your own life. And the reminder it offers is this: the floor needs cleaning. Not a floor in a famous building, this floor, the floor you live near, the floor you can reach from here. The work is in front of you. Not the grand work, the immediate work. Not the work that will transform the world, the work that is here, that is real, that can be done with your hands now in this hour. That is enough. That is in fact everything. Chuck Feeney, in the 13 years during which he was secretly one of the most significant philanthropists in the world, while officially being listed as a billionaire by Forbes, had a particular daily life that is worth describing in some detail. Because the daily life is the thing that is hardest to imagine when you're trying to understand a choice like his. He woke in his rented apartment. Not a modest apartment by ordinary standards. He was not performing poverty, and he was not uncomfortable, but an apartment, a place with walls and a door and a lease that someone else owned the building of. He ate simply. He did not have a chef. He did not have a household staff. He had the ordinary apparatus of an ordinary person's morning: a kitchen, a coffee pot, the particular silence of early morning in a city apartment before the world gets moving. He got dressed in ordinary clothes, not expensive clothes, not fashionable clothes, not the subtle expensive signalling clothes of old money, which look simple but cost a great deal, and which anyone who knows things knows at a glance. Just clothes. He travelled by taxi and subway and on foot. He worked. He worked hard and at length, and with the particular focus of a man who is trying to give away $8 billion wisely in a single lifetime, which is, it should be said, not an easy job. The giving required attention, judgment, knowledge of the institutions and communities being funded, relationships with the people running those institutions, an understanding of what actually worked and what merely sounded good. He travelled constantly, not in the way of a wealthy man, first class, the hotel with the best view, the driver waiting at the arrivals hall, in the way of an ordinary businessman, economy, the hotel that was near the meeting, the taxi with whoever happened to be driving. He met people, he listened, he made decisions about where the money would go and how much and under what conditions. And then he went back to the apartment. And started again. This is not a romantic life, in the obvious sense. There is nothing particularly picturesque about it. A man in ordinary clothes carrying a plastic bag, in an economy seat. A man who is doing a very large job in the least conspicuous way he can manage. But there is a quality in it that is worth noticing. The quality of things not carried. Feeney carried almost nothing that was not necessary. The plastic bag instead of the briefcase. The economy seat instead of the footrest and the warm towel. The rented apartment instead of the property whose value must be tracked and maintained and protected from the market. All of these not carrieds, all of these deliberate refusals to accumulate the particular physical and logistical weight of wealth, added up to something. They added up to lightness. Not the lightness of poverty. Poverty is its own kind of weight, and it is not light. But the specific lightness of a person who has looked at the things that accumulate around money and decided deliberately not to let them accumulate. Who has said, each time the question arose, do I need this? Is this necessary? Does this serve the work? And who has, most of the time, answered no. The thing is not necessary. The thing does not serve the work. The thing can be left behind. And in the leaving behind, in the accumulation of all the things not carried, a particular kind of mobility becomes available. Not just physical mobility, though the man travelling light moves more easily than the man with the large luggage, but a deeper mobility, the mobility of someone who is not managing a property or tracking a portfolio or arranging the care of a collection or maintaining the staff of a household. The mobility of someone whose attention is available. Because all the things that are not being managed are not taking attention. And attention, it turns out, is the resource that cannot be purchased. You cannot buy more attention. You can only free it by reducing the number of things it is required to manage. The small apartment does not require much attention. The economy seat does not require management. The plastic bag does not need to be tracked. All of that freed attention, all of it, goes to the work. To the school in Arkansas. To the clinic in Vietnam. To the university building in Ireland. To the peace process in Northern Ireland. To the $8 billion of work done with freed attention over the course of a single working life. This is what things not carried make possible. The weight you put down is the work you can pick up. Every piece of property not owned is a room of attention freed for something else. Every first-class seat declined is an hour of focus available. Every Rolex not worn is a morning of presents returned. Feeney understood this in the particular way that people who have thought very clearly about what things are for tend to understand things. And the understanding produced the life. The plastic bag and the economy seat and the $15 watch and the rented apartment are not aesthetics. They are consequences. Consequences of a very clear answer to a very clear question. What is the money for? It is not for my comfort. It is for the work. Therefore, the minimum necessary for my comfort, the rest for the work. Everything that is not necessary for my comfort is available for the work. The calculation is simple. The discipline required to live it is not simple. But the calculation itself is simple. And the life that the calculation produces is, in its own way, beautiful. Not beautiful in the way of old money, the beeswax polish and the old paper and the silver catching the light, but beautiful in the way of something that is exactly what it needs to be, and nothing more. The right size. The right weight. Just what is necessary. And all the rest given away. The year is 1934. The place is Yale University, New Haven, Connecticut. A young man is sitting in a lecture hall. He is 22 years old. He is by any reasonable measure one of the most fortunate human beings alive. His grandfather built one of the largest fortunes in the history of industrial capitalism. His family name is known to every American. The world, in most senses that matter, is arranged around him like furniture arranged to receive an honoured guest. He is failing his classes. Not because he is unintelligent. He is, by all accounts, quite intelligent, though in a way that does not express itself well in lecture halls. Not because he is lazy, exactly. But because something about sitting in those rooms, absorbing knowledge that will be evaluated by people who have never done a real day of physical work in their lives, and that will qualify him for positions his family name would give him anyway. Something about the whole arrangement feels to him like a performance of seriousness rather than seriousness itself. His name is Winthrop Rockefeller. He is the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the man who built Standard Oil, the man whose fortune, at its peak, represented a larger share of the American economy than the wealth of any person before or since. His father is John D. Rockefeller Jr., who has spent his adult life carefully managing and distributing the vast inheritance he received, funding the restoration of colonial Williamsburg and the construction of Rockefeller Center and the endowment of universities and hospitals and research institutions across the country. Winthrop will not do any of those things. What Winthrop will do, what he does, in the spring of 1934, when he leaves Yale without his degree and with no clear plan and his family's considerable dismay following him like weather, is go to Texas. He goes to the oil fields. Not to inspect them, not to oversee them, not to visit the operations of one of the many companies that trace their lineage back to Standard Oil and are, in some sense, extensions of his grandfather's life's work. He goes to work in them. He becomes a roughneck. This is the technical term, roughneck, for the men who work on oil drilling rigs. The men who handle the drill pipe, who manage the heavy iron equipment, who work in shifts around the clock in the heat and the noise and the thick smell of crude, who come off their shifts covered in grease and mud and go to sleep in the simple bunkhouses that the oil companies provide. The work is difficult. It is loud. It requires the kind of strength and the kind of attention that cannot be faked. The drill pipe is heavy. The equipment is dangerous. You do not learn it by reading about it. You learn it by doing it, badly at first, and then less badly, and then with the quiet competence that comes from having done a hard thing many times until it becomes a second nature. Winthrop Rockefeller worked those oil fields in Texas and Louisiana for several years. He did not announce himself. He did not tell his fellow workers who his grandfather was. He was not hiding exactly, or his name was his name, and anyone who looked closely enough would have known. But he did not lead with it. He showed up at the start of the shift and did the work and went to sleep and showed up again. Later in his life, he said that those were the happiest years he had known. Not the years in New York, moving in the circles that a Rockefeller was expected to move in. Not the years of parties and social obligations and the endless, exhausting business of being one of the richest families in the world. The years in the mud. The years of doing something with his hands that was clearly, unambiguously, visibly useful, where the day's work had a concrete result you could point to, where your value to the people around you was not determined by your name but by whether you could manage your end of the drill pipe. He wrote later, "I wanted to be the person who showed up and had to prove himself. Not the person who showed up and had already proved himself by virtue of being born. There is something in this that connects to the deepest human desire, not for comfort which can be given, but for the sense of having earned one's place, of having contributed something that would not have been there without you. This is not a feeling that can be purchased. It cannot be administered by a trust fund. It cannot be given by a name, however distinguished. It is earned in the particular way that only difficult work earns it, by doing the thing, badly, and then doing it again and again until you are good at it, and the goodness is yours." Winthrop spent those years learning what he could not have learned in any lecture hall or any boardroom, or any of the charitable foundations his family had built. He learned what physical work costs, what it does to a body, what kind of fatigue it produces, and what kind of rest that fatigue requires. He learned the particular camaraderie of men who work hard together, the wordless understanding between people who have shared a difficult task and are not required to talk about it. He learned the particular pleasure of a clean bunkhouse and a hot meal after a long shift. Simple pleasures, nothing like the pleasures of the life he'd been born into, which were elaborate and carefully arranged and somehow never quite satisfying. These were satisfying. The meal was satisfying because he was hungry. The bunk was satisfying because he was tired. The morning coffee was satisfying because the shift started early and he needed it to work. All of it was earned. All of it was consequential. His presence or absence in the world mattered in a small and daily way to the people he worked alongside. He had not felt that before. He would not forget it. There is a letter Winthrop wrote to a friend during those Texas years. It has not been widely quoted because Winthrop was not the sort of person who sought publicity for his private thoughts. But the letter survives, and in it he describes something that will sound familiar to anyone who has ever chosen a simpler life after a complicated one. He describes the quality of the mornings. He writes about waking up early, earlier than he had ever willingly woken in New York, in the simple wooden bunkhouse, with the smell of coffee already coming from the cookhouse across the yard, and the sound of the other men getting up, and the sky outside beginning its slow change from black to the deep blue of pre-dawn. He writes about how clear everything felt at that hour, how uncomplicated. There was the shift, which started at 7. There was the work, which was what it was. There was the end of the shift, when you were done. No decisions to make about what it all meant. No sense of floating above consequence. No weight of a name and a fortune and a set of obligations that belonged, when you thought about it honestly, to someone who was no longer alive. Just the work. Just the morning. Just the coffee. He writes, "I think I am finally in the right size of life." That phrase, the right size of life. He had grown up in a life too large for him. Not too large in material terms. He had managed the material largeness well enough, with the ease of someone who has never known anything different, but too large in a different sense, too wide, too much space between himself and the consequences of his choices, too much distance between where he sat and where the real work happened. In the oil fields, the life was the right size. He could see all of it from where he stood. He could feel all of it in his hands. He was for the first time somewhere that made sense. Later, Winthrop Rockefeller would leave the oil fields and return to New York and marry and divorce and make a certain kind of life that fitted, more or less, the expectations of who he was. But something had been understood, something that could not be unfamiliar again. In 1953, tired of the social obligations of New York, Tired of being the lesser-known Rockefeller brother in a family full of men who seemed to know exactly what they were for, he left. He did not go back to Texas. He went to Arkansas. This is a choice that confused everyone who knew him, and that continues to confuse people who encounter the story for the first time, because Arkansas in 1953 was not, by any standard that New York recognized, a place where a Rockefeller was supposed to be. It was one of the poorest states in the country. It had no particular society. It had no opera house, no Fifth Avenue, no clubs where men of his kind gathered over good scotch to speak about things of consequence. It had a mountain. Specifically, it had Petit Jean Mountain, 60 miles west of Little Rock, where Winthrop bought 927 acres of land and where he built a farm. Not a gentleman's farm, not the kind of picturesque agricultural operation that wealthy Americans of the time built as a gesture toward the simple life. The kind where the animals are beautiful, and the barns are well painted, and you can have friends from the city come to admire the arrangement without anyone getting too dirty. A working farm. He named it Winrock Farm. He raised Santa Gertrudis cattle, a tough breed developed for the Texas heat. He learned their biology, their diseases, their breeding requirements. He worked with his farm hands, genuinely worked, not observed them working, and in time the farm became internationally known for the quality of its stock. Buyers came from across the world to purchase Winrock cattle. The brand was respected. He had built something, with his hands, with his knowledge, with the specific care of a man who had shown up on a mountaintop in Arkansas, with the determination to make a thing that was genuinely good, not merely well-funded. His fellow Rockefellers did not quite understand. They were polite about it because the Rockefellers were always polite, but there was a quiet bewilderment in the way they spoke about Winthrop's Arkansas years. What was he doing down there? What was the point? He said when asked that he was trying to be useful. He was tired, he said, of being impressive. The distinction he was drawing was real, even if it was hard to explain to people for whom impressiveness was the point of most things. Being impressive means occupying a space and being noted. Being useful means doing something that would not have been done without you. Being impressive is about how others see you. Being useful is about what the world has that it did not have before. Winthrop wanted to build things, actual things. The farm. Later, schools and medical clinics across Arkansas's poorest counties, because the poverty he saw there troubled him in a way that the poverty of city charity work had never quite managed to trouble him. When you live in a place, when you know the children by name, when you can drive to the clinic and see whether the equipment you paid for is actually working, the poverty is different. It has weight. It has faces. He put over $1 million into schools in a single Arkansas county, not because he was required to, not because it served any social purpose for himself. The people of rural Arkansas were not people who could advance his position in any world he might otherwise want to inhabit, but because he had seen the need, and he was there. He had made himself local. And being local made all the difference. We will return to Winthrop Rockefeller, but for now, let his story sit beside Tolstoy's, in that companionable way that stories sit when they are about the same thing approached from different directions. One man in Russia with a scythe against his writing desk. One man on an Arkansas mountaintop learning the breeding requirements of a particularly hardy breed of cattle. Both of them the inheritors of something enormous. Both of them, in the way that most mattered to them, trying to be ordinary. Trying to be in the right size of life. There is something worth pausing on before we move to the next story. Something about what it costs to choose a smaller life when a larger one is available. Because it is not without cost. The men in this story paid for their choices in ways that were real, even if they were not the ways that most people pay for most things. Winthrop was the least famous of his brothers for most of his life. While Nelson was governor of New York and eventually vice president of the United States, while David was running one of the largest banks in the world, while John was building cultural institutions in New York and Asia, Winthrop was in Arkansas, raising cattle and building clinics. He was not obscure, the Rockefeller name was too large for obscurity, but he was, by the standards of his family, operating in a smaller theatre. He had chosen that. He had chosen the smaller theatre precisely because it was smaller, because in a smaller theatre, the work you do is visible all the way to the back of the room. This is what the men in this story were all, in different ways, looking for. Not invisibility, though some of them found that too and valued it, but visibility of the right kind, the kind where you can see the result of your work with your own eyes, in your own lifetime, in a place you actually know. The cattle on the hillside, the clinic with the new equipment, the school with the good teacher. These are things that a man can see when he drives to the end of a familiar road on a familiar mountain in a state that other people do not consider worthy of a Rockefeller. He can see exactly what he has done, and it is enough. It is more than enough. It is the right size. In 1988, Forbes magazine published its annual list of the 400 wealthiest Americans. Number 23 on that list was a man named Charles Feeney. He was listed with a fortune of approximately $1.3 billion. The source of the money was a chain of duty-free shops, duty-free shoppers, which Feeney and a college classmate had founded in 1960 in Hong Kong, and which had grown over 3 decades into the world's largest duty-free retail operation. Airports across the world, Honolulu, Hong Kong, London, Paris, had those shops. Japanese tourists in the 60s and 70s, newly free to travel after decades of restricted movement, had discovered them and spent lavishly, and the shops had grown into a global empire. Chuck Feeney, he was always called Chuck, was in the cold arithmetic of the Forbes list extraordinarily wealthy. He was also, by 1988, worth much less than $5 million. The two facts are not contradictory. They require only one additional fact to make sense. In 1984, secretly, without telling his business partners, without filing any public document that would make the transfer visible, Charles Feeney had given away his entire fortune. Not invested it in a way that he could reclaim later, not put it in a complex legal structure that preserved his nominal ownership while shuffling the control, given it away, transferred his entire stake in duty-free shoppers, then worth approximately $500 million, to a charitable foundation he had established in Bermuda, in the particular legal form that required no public disclosure. His business partners did not know. The lawyers did not know, except the one who had structured the foundation. Nobody knew. For 13 years. Forbes was listing him as a billionaire. Business magazines were profiling him as one of America's great commercial success stories, and all the while, Chuck Feeney had nothing. He was renting a small apartment. He did not own the apartment. He flew economy class. Not in the pointed, self-conscious way of a billionaire making a statement about his values, but in the ordinary way of a man who could not afford first class. He carried a plastic bag instead of a briefcase. He wore a $15 digital watch, a Casio, the kind you buy at a drugstore. He got around by taxi and subway and on his own 2 feet. He was not performing poverty. He was living it. And he was happier, by his own account, than he had ever been. The story of how he was discovered, how the fact of his extraordinary secret giving was eventually revealed to the world, begins in 1997, when Bernard Arnault's luxury goods company LVMH bought the other partner's shares in duty-free shoppers. The legal process of that sale required a thorough accounting of ownership, and the lawyers doing that accounting discovered, to their considerable surprise, that Chuck Feeney owned nothing. He was not on the shareholder register. His $500 million stake was held by a foundation registered in Bermuda called Atlantic Philanthropies. When Arnault's lawyers asked Feeney's lawyers who controlled Atlantic Philanthropies, the answer was the same man who had founded it, the same man who had transferred his entire fortune to it in 1984, the same man who had been flying economy class for 13 years while Forbes listed him as a billionaire. The story came out. The journalists arrived, and Feeney, who was the kind of man who genuinely did not enjoy publicity, not in the fashionable, studied way of celebrities who claim to hate fame while constructing it with great care, but in the actual way, the way of a man from a working-class Irish-American family in New Jersey who'd made an extraordinary amount of money and simply had no desire to be talked about. Feeney was quietly, firmly unembarrassed. He said he had not wanted money to consume his life. He said it simply without drama, not as a declaration, as a statement of fact. He had not wanted money to consume his life, and so he had given it away. It is worth pausing here to understand where Charles Feeney came from, because the path to this particular act of giving was not the path of inherited wealth, the path of the men in other parts of this story. Feeney was not born rich. He was born in 1931 in Elizabeth, New Jersey, to an Irish-American family during the Depression. His father was an insurance underwriter. His mother was a hospital nurse. They were not poor by the standards of the Depression, but they were working-class people who understood money as something you earned carefully and spent carefully. Feeney grew up with that understanding. He went into the Air Force. He served in post-war Japan and Korea. He went to Cornell on the GI Bill and studied hotel administration. He had the particular quality that some people develop in conditions of genuine scarcity, a sense of the value of things, a reflex toward thrift, a deep discomfort with waste. When he made his fortune, and he made it through genuine commercial ingenuity, through the duty-free concept that he developed and expanded across the world, this reflex did not change. His partners changed, the business changed, the scale of the money changed. But Feeney himself did not change. He remained a man who flew economy and carried a plastic bag and wore a $15 watch, not because these things were virtuous in themselves, but because they were the appropriate scale for a human life in his understanding. One person, one seat on a plane, one wrist. What does any of that need to be first class? He said once, when asked why he flew economy, that economy class got to the same place as first class did. This is true. It is also the kind of statement that only sounds simple. Behind its simplicity is a whole philosophy about what things are for, about the relationship between the experience of a thing and the price of the experience, about whether the extra comfort of a wider seat and a warmer towel and a slightly better meal is an improvement large enough to justify the difference in cost. Feeney had looked at that difference in cost and done a different calculation from most billionaires. He had looked at what the extra money bought, the ease, the comfort, the slight elevation of the already comfortable. And then he had looked at what that same money could do somewhere else. A medical clinic, a scholarship, a university building, a program that trained doctors in a country where doctors were scarce. And the comparison was not close. He gave it to the medical clinic. He gave it to the scholarship. He gave it to the university building. He gave it to the training program. He did this not once, not in a single magnificent gesture, but continuously for decades. $8 billion over the course of his lifetime, through Atlantic philanthropies, to causes in Ireland and Vietnam and South Africa and Australia and the United States, places he had connections to, places he had seen, places where he had identified specific needs and specific opportunities. He did not give to causes that would name things after him. In fact, his grants to universities and hospitals explicitly required, for many years, that his identity as the donor not be revealed. The buildings that his money built did not have his name above the door. He did not want his name above the door. He wanted the building to exist. This is a distinction that sounds subtle but is actually quite large. Most philanthropy, not all, but most, involves a transaction that goes something like this. I give money, and in return my name goes on the building, and my name going on the building communicates to the world that I am generous. And this communication is valuable to me in various ways that are not unrelated to why I have money in the first place. Chuck Feeney did not want this. He wanted the building. Just the building. There is a word for what Feeney was doing, though it is not a word that is used much in the circles where philanthropy is usually discussed. The word is anonymous. Not anonymous in the sense of hiding. He was not hiding exactly, though he was certainly not broadcasting. Anonymous in the deeper sense, without a self attached to the gift as pure gift, not as investment in one's own legacy. This is actually very old. It appears in most religious traditions in various forms. In Jewish tradition, the highest form of charity is the gift that is given in such a way that neither the giver nor the recipient knows the other's identity. In Christian tradition, the Sermon on the Mount specifically cautions against giving alms in public so that others can see. Feeney was not performing humility. He was genuinely humble, in the functional sense that his own comfort and reputation mattered less to him than the work. He completed his goal in 2020. By then he was 88 years old. He had spent his entire working fortune, the billions he had earned, and Atlantic Philanthropies was closed. He was living in a small rented apartment in San Francisco. He owned no property. He was not wealthy. He was, in the modest financial sense, not much different from where he had started, in that working-class house in New Jersey, where his father was an insurance underwriter and his mother was a nurse. He said he felt satisfied. The word he used was satisfied. Not happy, though he was happy. Not proud, though he had reason to be. Satisfied, as in, the work was done. The thing he had set out to do he had done. The money had gone to the things that needed it. He could see, in the buildings and the programs and the research and the peace processes that his giving had helped along, what the money had become. It had become things. Real things. Not first-class seats on planes, not a wide wristwatch, not a large house in a beautiful place. A medical system in Vietnam that could treat its own sick. A university infrastructure in Ireland that had helped transform one of Europe's poorest countries into one of its most prosperous. A peace process in Northern Ireland that had, genuinely, helped bring along violence to something approaching rest. These things existed and would continue to exist after he was gone. He had held $8 billion for a while, and then he had let it go. And the letting go had felt, by his account, like the most natural thing in the world. Like putting down a weight he had been carrying on behalf of other people for a long time, and finally, at the end of the journey, delivering it to where it was supposed to be. The economy seat. The plastic bag. The $15 watch. The small apartment. These were not deprivations. They were, in his view, the appropriate furnishings of a human life. One person, the right size. There is something Warren Buffett said about Chuck Feeney that bears repeating here, not because Buffett's opinion validates Feeney's choices, Feeney needed no validation, but because it points to something the story might otherwise leave implicit. Buffett said, "Chuck is a model for us all. It will take me 12 years after my death to accomplish what he is completing within his lifetime." What Buffett meant was this. Most billionaires, however philanthropically inclined, give their money away through foundations that are designed to outlast them. The money keeps accumulating. The foundation keeps operating. The giving continues after the giver is gone. This is not wrong, but it means that the giver never sees the full result, never knows what the last of the money became. Feeney insisted on seeing. He wanted to be alive when the last grant was made. He wanted to know, with his own eyes, what had happened to the money. He wanted to see what a human life could do when it was used for something other than its own comfort. He saw. And the seeing, he said, was everything. We will carry Chuck Feeney with us as we move through the rest of this night. His qualities, the economy seat, the plastic bag, the insistence on anonymity, the refusal to let money consume the shape of his life, will appear again, in different forms, in the other stories we have to tell. Because these qualities, it turns out, are not peculiar to one man. They are available to anyone who decides, at whatever scale, that the appropriate size of a human life is not determined by the size of its bank account. That what you need is a seat on the plane, not a particular kind of seat. That what you need is somewhere to sleep, not a particular kind of somewhere. That the watch tells you the time whether it costs $15 or $15,000. These are obvious statements. They are also very easy to lose sight of, in a world that works very hard to convince you otherwise. Feeney did not lose sight. And the not losing sight is, in a way, the hardest part of the whole story. More so, perhaps, than any single act of giving. Just not forgetting what actually matters. Every morning for decades in economy class, with his plastic bag and his $15 watch. Not forgetting. Let that be the last image before we move on. The economy seat, the window or the aisle, the ordinary view, the ordinary world coming through the ordinary window, neither elevated nor diminished. Just visible. Just real. Just what it is. There is a particular quality to the hours before a shift begins. The roughneck wakes before light, not because anyone has told him to, but because the body, trained by months of early starts, has calibrated itself. The alarm is almost unnecessary. The body is already awake, already beginning the low-level preparation for the work ahead. He dresses in the half-dark, not the wardrobe of a man of wealth, not the particular subtle expensive quality of the clothes that signal, to those who know, that the wearer does not need to try. Just clothes. Work clothes. The kind of clothes that will take the mud and the grease and the 12 hours in the heat and still be wearable tomorrow. He goes to the cookhouse or the mess tent or whatever the particular provision for meals happens to be on this particular rig, in this particular part of the Texas oil fields, in this particular year of the 1930s. The coffee is not good coffee. It is the coffee that is available, in the quantity that is needed at the hour when it is needed. He drinks it. He eats. He goes to the rig. The rig does not care who his grandfather was. The rig is not impressed. The rig is a piece of machinery operating according to physical laws, and the physical laws are what they are regardless of the name on the trust documents. The drill pipe is what it is. The work is what it is. And Winthrop Rockefeller, grandson of the man who had once been the richest in America, heir to a name that still carried the weight of Standard Oil, son of the man who was restoring colonial Williamsburg and endowing research institutes across the country, Winthrop Rockefeller picked up his end of the drill pipe and pulled. This is the moment. This is the specific moment that all the philosophy in the world, all of Tolstoy's essays and Carnegie's gospel, and the centuries of thought about wealth and virtue and what the powerful owe the powerless, this is the moment where all of that abstraction becomes specific. The weight of the drill pipe. The Texas heat. The 12 hours ahead. The coffee that was not good coffee finished now, leaving its particular bitter residue. And the choice, the continuous, renewable, daily choice, to be there, to pull, to do the work that is in front of you, with the body you have, in the heat of the day, alongside the men who are doing the same work without the choice you had to be doing something else. He later described those years in terms of what they taught him about time. He had grown up with a particular relationship to time, the relationship of a person for whom time was, in the most fundamental sense, available, not scarce, not something that needed to be managed against the pressure of necessity. Time that could be arranged, could be structured, could be filled or unfilled according to preference and situation. The oil fields taught him a different relationship. The shift was the shift. Time was structured by the work, not by preference. You could not negotiate with the drill pipe. You could not decide that you would rather begin a little later today, or take a longer break at noon, or skip the difficult part until tomorrow. The work was there. It did not wait. And this not waiting quality of the work, this indifference to preference, this organizing of the day according to necessity rather than choice, was one of the most clarifying experiences of his life. Because he discovered that when time is structured by necessity, you waste less of it. The hours of a managed day, the hours of committee meetings and estate planning and the social obligations of the well-situated, were hours that always contained the possibility of having been better used. Hours that left a mild residue of the question, was that the right thing to be doing? The hours of the shift did not contain that question. There was the work. The work was what there was. When the work was done, the work was done. And that completeness, that closing of the question at the end of each working day, was something he had not found in any other arrangement of his time. He had been given every advantage, had been provided with every kind of time that a man could want. And he had spent his happiest hours with his hands on a piece of equipment that did not know his name, in a state where nobody had heard of his grandfather, doing work that produced oil that would be refined and sold and used by people who would never know where it came from. He had been happy. Genuinely, deeply, specifically happy. Not the happiness of satisfaction at the management of things. The happiness of a body doing work. The happiness of a self in the right size of life. The happiness of earning day by day in the most immediate and physical sense his place among the people around him. These mornings, these long afternoons, this tiredness. This was the life. This was what he'd been looking for. Before the Texas oil fields, before the Arkansas mountain, before all the choices he was going to make, this was the discovery. The discovery of himself outside the house with the carved fireplace and the silver and the lawn. Outside the name. Outside the arrangement. Just himself. And the work. And the morning that came before it, every day, with its particular light and its not good coffee and its indifferent heat. And the shift. And the pipe. And the day. The specific quality of being raised with great wealth that these men were trying to remedy. The hollow feeling, the floating feeling, the sense of being a very comfortable cabinet that no one has ever quite opened, has a history that is longer than America. It appears in the letters of Roman senators who had inherited the fortunes built by their grandfathers, and who found, in middle age, that they were capable of nothing they could be proud of. It appears in the diaries of English landowners who looked across their estates in the 18th century and wondered what any of it was for. It appears in the correspondence of Chinese aristocrats and Indian merchant families, and Russian nobility, and Dutch merchants' sons, everywhere, across every era, in which wealth has moved from the generation that built it to the generation that inherited it. The pattern is so consistent that it has been noticed and named and debated for thousands of years. The Bible version, the young man who asked what he must do to inherit eternal life and was told to sell all he had and went away sorrowful. The Stoic version, the man whose freedom from want is also in some sense freedom from the urgency of living. The Buddhist version, the prince who had everything and found that having everything was itself a kind of suffering. The American version, the grandson of the great industrialist who looked out the window of the family house and felt, at 35, that he had not yet actually begun. In every version the structure is the same. A person has more than they need. The having more than they need, which is supposed to be the end of the story, turns out to be the beginning of a different problem. The problem of being without necessity. Because necessity, the quiet pressure of needing to do something in order for something else to be all right, is the hidden engine of most human motivation. When the engine is removed because there is no necessity, because the food is there, the shelter is there, the security is there, without anything being required, something else has to take its place. And finding what takes its place is, it turns out, one of the harder projects a human being can undertake. Money doesn't solve it. More money doesn't solve it. The man who inherits $1 billion instead of 10 million has not solved the problem. He has simply made it larger. Work helps, not work as distraction, not work as performance, but work as genuine necessity. The work that matters because someone is counting on it. That needs to be done because otherwise it won't be done. That exists in the world as a real demand on a real person's real time and attention and hands. That work, the work of genuine necessity, is what several of the men in this story went looking for. Not the work of inherited obligation, not the work of managing the family's assets and attending the right meetings and sitting on the right boards. That work existed, and some of them did some of it, and it had a certain kind of weight, but it was not the right kind. The right kind was the kind you had to go find. In the oil fields, on the Arkansas mountain, in the hospital corridor, in the middle school classroom. The right kind of work was the kind that did not know your name and required you anyway. That did not care what your grandfather had built. That only knew whether you showed up, and whether you could do the job. There is something worth resting in here. Because the question, the one that was being answered by all these differently dramatic choices, is not so different from questions that are available to anyone at any scale. Not the dramatic question of whether to give away a fortune. That is specific to people who have fortunes. Most people do not have fortunes. But the underlying question: what am I for? What is the right size of my life? Am I doing the work that is actually mine, or the work that was arranged for me by people who are no longer here? Is this floor, this classroom, this kitchen, this job, this daily labour, is it mine? Did I choose it? Do I show up for it? Really show up with my hands and my attention and the genuine weight of my presence? Or am I managing it from a slight distance, floating just above the surface of my own life, efficient but not present, responsible but not committed? These questions are not the exclusive property of the sons of old money. They are available to anyone who has ever sat at a table, not necessarily a table with silver on it, just a table, and felt the hollow feeling, the floating feeling, the sense that the life they are in is not quite theirs. The remedy the men in this story found was to put their hands on something real, something that required them, something that would not have been done without them. The drill pipe, the mop, the lesson plan, the cattle on the hillside. These things required them, specifically them in that place, on that day, with their particular hands. And that requiring, that being specifically, personally, unreplaceably required, was the thing that made them feel, perhaps for the first time in their lives, actually present. Actually here. Actually in the right size of life. This is not a lesson about wealth. This is a lesson about presence. About the particular dignity of being needed in the specific and immediate and floor-level way of someone who has a job to do and shows up and does it. About the discovery that the ordinary work, the work that gets no recognition, that produces no legacy, that is simply done and then done again and then done again, is, after all, the extraordinary work. Because it is real. Because it is there. Because the floor is clean. And the clean floor is the result of a person who was there, who paid attention, who used their hands. That is enough. That is, in fact, all there is. There is something that happens to a building when it is well maintained. Nothing. That is the point. The pipes do not burst, the lights work, the floors are clean, the bathrooms are functional, the windows open and close as they should, the heating keeps pace with the weather. The building does what a building is supposed to do, which is to function invisibly, so that the people inside it can do whatever they came to do. And the invisibility of the functioning, the fact that you can be in a well-maintained building for an entire day without thinking once about the building, is the sign that the work of maintenance is being done correctly. The janitor's art is the art of invisibility. Not in a hiding sense, in the sense that the result of the work is the absence of problems, the absence of disorder, the presence of a functioning environment that no one needs to think about. This is a different kind of art from the art that leaves traces, from the art of the sculptor whose work remains, or the architect whose buildings stand for generations, or the writer whose words persist. The janitor's art is daily, renewable. It must be done again tomorrow and again the day after, and the work of yesterday does not protect against the dirt of today. But this renewability, this dailiness, is also one of its particular qualities. It cannot be done in advance and then set aside. It cannot be endowed. It cannot be funded into existence by a bequest or a foundation. It must be done by a person with a mop on this day, in this hour, in this particular building. And the person who does it is, in that daily and specific sense, irreplaceable. There is a feeling, one of the men in this story described it carefully, in a letter written late in his years of maintenance work, of walking into a building in the early morning. Before the regular occupants arrive. When the building is yours, not yours in the ownership sense, in the custodial sense, in the sense that you are responsible for it, that its condition this morning is a result of the work you did yesterday and the day before, and that its condition tomorrow will be a result of what you do today. He described the quality of the building at that hour. The silence, not an empty silence, but a full one. The silence of a space that is waiting, that is ready, that has been prepared. The particular smell of a clean floor, of a space that has been attended to. The light coming in at its early angle, showing the surfaces clean and still. He described the pleasure of knowing this, of being the person who had made this possible, who had done the work that made the building ready for the day, who would not be thanked for it, because there was nothing to thank. The building was simply, quietly, as it should be. And he described this as one of the primary satisfactions of his life. This man, who had been born into circumstances so elevated that the question of what building to put his name on was one that had genuinely been available to him, found his deepest daily satisfaction in the preparation of a building whose name was not his. In the work that preceded every working day and made every working day possible. In the invisible infrastructure of someone else's everything. This is a very old understanding. There is a tradition in certain monasteries, and the men in this story were not all religious, not all monastic in any conscious sense, but the tradition speaks to something they found independently. There is a tradition in certain monasteries of assigning the senior members, the most experienced, the most accomplished monks, to the most menial tasks. Not as punishment, as honour. The reasoning is this: the menial task requires less performance, requires less of the social apparatus of importance, requires the full attention of the person doing it, not the performance of importance, but the work itself. And for a person who has spent years learning to quiet the part of the mind that is always performing, always narrating, always building the story of the self, the menial task is a gift. Because it demands presence and offers nothing else. The floor asks only that you clean it. It does not ask who you are. It does not require that you perform competence. It only asks that you show up and clean it and do this well. And in that asking, in the simple, non-negotiable daily demand of the floor, something becomes possible. Something that the large life, the life arranged around a great fortune and a great name, was too full of performance to allow. Something like quiet. Something like rest. Something like the experience of being in a body that is doing a thing, without the mind running ahead to what the thing means, or whether it is impressive, or how it will be regarded. Just the floor. Just the mop. Just the morning. Just here. The men who found their way to this, who found the janitor's particular piece, or the roughnecks, or the farmers, found it to be one of the most significant things they had ever experienced. More significant, some of them said, than anything the large life had offered. Not because it was harder. Because it was simpler. Because it asked of them only what they could actually give. Their presence. Their attention. Their hands. Their showing up. And having only those things to give, not a name, not a fortune, not the whole apparatus of inherited circumstance, was, in the end, sufficient. It was, in the end, the right size. In the 1880s, the richest man in the world was a man named William Henry Vanderbilt. He had inherited his father's fortune, the Commodore's railroad and shipping empire, and in less than a decade had doubled it. He was shrewd, he was diligent, he was, in the ways that his era valued, extremely successful. He was also, by his own account, not particularly happy. He said this plainly, in a remark that was recorded by a journalist and that has been quoted in varying forms ever since, and that deserves to be considered carefully, because it is one of the clearest statements of a particular feeling ever made by a man of immense wealth. He looked out the window at his neighbour's house and said, "He isn't worth 100th part as much as I am, but he has more of the real pleasures of life than I have. His house is as comfortable as mine, even if it didn't cost so much. His team is about as good as mine, his opera box is next to mine, his health is better than mine, and he will probably outlive me, and he can trust his friends." And then he said, "Being the richest person in the world brought me nothing but anxiety." He was at that moment the richest person in the world. He was not satisfied. This is a story that has been used in many ways since William Henry Vanderbilt said it. It has been used as a warning against the pursuit of wealth, as an argument for moderation, as a data point in the long philosophical debate about money and happiness. But there is a specific detail in what he said that is less often examined, and that is the thing about trusting friends. He can trust his friends. This is the detail that lodges. Because William Henry Vanderbilt, the richest man in the world, could not trust his friends, not fully, not in the simple way that his neighbour, a man with enough money for a comfortable house and a decent team of horses and an opera box, could trust the people around him. The neighbour's friends liked him because he was likeable, or they didn't, in which case they left. The relationship was, in its essentials, transparent. The richest man in the world could never be entirely certain, could never entirely separate the affection of the people around him from the calculations of the people around him, could never be quite sure when someone was kind to him, whether the kindness was for him or for his fortune. This is one of the specific injuries of great wealth, not a lack, not a deprivation of any ordinary kind, an addition, an extra variable in every human relationship that muddies the water in ways that cannot be cleared. The sons of old money grew up knowing this. It was in the air of those large, quiet houses, the understanding that your name and your money preceded you everywhere, and that sorting out who liked you from who liked your circumstances was a task that could not be completed with any certainty. Some of the men in this story cite this particular uncertainty, as part of what drove them towards simpler lives, toward places and occupations where their fortune was not the dominant fact about them. Winthrop Rockefeller in the oil fields, not anonymous, his name was his name, but in circumstances where what you could do with your hands mattered more than who your grandfather was. Chuck Feeney in economy class, not hidden, he was known in the world of duty-free retail, but moving through the ordinary world without the markers that announce wealth and trigger the particular responses that wealth triggers. These men were not seeking to deceive anyone. They were seeking, in their different ways, to find out what they were like without the frame. Who they were when the context was not arranged to receive them. Whether they could earn a place in a room without the fortune as a ticket. The Vanderbilt family had a reunion in 1973. 120 descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt gathered at Vanderbilt University, the institution that the Commodore's money had helped found. Not one of them was a millionaire. The fortune that had been, in the 1880s, the largest in the history of American private wealth, larger proportionally than any fortune that has existed since, had dispersed entirely. Through spending and inheritance taxes and the simple arithmetic of dividing a large number by an ever larger number of heirs, through lavish houses and expensive parties, and the endless cost of maintaining the appearance of being the Vanderbilts, it had gone. 120 people, not a millionaire among them. What they had was the name. And the name at that point was mostly useful for getting into the university bearing it, which they had just done for the reunion. Now it would be too easy and too false to read this as tragedy. Some of the people at that 1973 reunion were, by most measures, living good lives. They had educations and families and work they found meaningful. The fortune had dispersed, but it had dispersed into people, into the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of a man who had built an empire and who had failed to understand in his particular practical brilliance that an empire is not made of money but of people, and that money given without wisdom is not a gift but a burden. But some of those people at that reunion had grown up in a particular kind of difficulty that had nothing to do with poverty and everything to do with inheritance. There is a specific injury that happens to children raised in old money that is hard to articulate, but that shows up in biography after biography, diary after diary, conversation after conversation, when you spend time reading the private documents of the people who were born into great wealth in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is the injury of never having needed to prove yourself. Not in the sense that makes people arrogant, though sometimes it makes people arrogant. In a quieter sense. In the sense that the ordinary human project of constructing yourself, of testing what you can do against what the world requires, of earning your sense of who you are through the experience of doing difficult things and surviving them, that project never quite happens because it is not required. You do not need to prove yourself. The world has already arranged itself around your name. There is a place at the table before you have done anything to earn it. And this, it turns out, can be its own kind of deprivation. Not the deprivation of having nothing. The deprivation of never having had to fight for anything. The psychologist Abraham Maslow, who spent most of the middle of the 20th century thinking about human motivation and what human beings need in order to flourish, put forward the idea, now so familiar it has become cliché, which is the fate of true ideas, that human beings have a hierarchy of needs, ranging from the basic physical needs of food and shelter, up through safety and love and belonging, to what he called self-actualization, the need to become what you are capable of being. And Maslow noted carefully that this final need, the need to become, requires struggle, requires resistance, requires the experience of pushing against something that does not simply give way. The sons of old money had everything up and down that hierarchy except the resistance. The food and shelter were provided, the safety was provided, the belonging, in the family and the social circle, in the institutions that bore the family name, was provided. But the resistance was not provided, and without the resistance, the becoming did not happen. Or it happened slowly, or it happened sideways in unexpected directions, in the decisions that these men made when they finally, in their 30s or 40s, decided to go somewhere they were not already expected. The oil fields, the Arkansas mountaintop, the economy seat on the transatlantic flight. These are the places where the resistance was, where they could finally push against something that would not simply give way because of who they were, where the becoming could begin. There was a Rockefeller, one of the fourth-generation cousins, as they were called, who said something in a document from the 1970s that has stayed with me since I first encountered it. He was one of a group of younger Rockefellers who had written, collectively, a kind of confession of their generation's complicated relationship with the family fortune. The document was intended to be private. It was not entirely private. He wrote, "We have an abundance of everything except feelings." It is not a complete statement. It is not fair exactly to his family, to his parents, who were not cold people, but it points at something real. The abundance, the houses, the foundations, the institutions, the carefully managed expressions of responsibility and stewardship, can fill so much of the space of a life that the ordinary human feelings, the ones that require vulnerability and need, and the possibility of loss, have nowhere to grow. You cannot feel the warmth of a fire very well if the room is already warm from a thermostat set to the perfect temperature. You cannot feel hunger in any meaningful way if every meal is already arranged. You cannot feel the satisfaction of having earned something if everything is already provided. And so some of these men, the more restless, the more honest, the ones who listened to the feeling in their chest rather than the expectation in the room, went looking for the cold, for the hunger, for something they would have to earn. Not masochistically, not as punishment, but as medicine. As the specific medicine for the specific condition of having been given too much too young, before the receiving self was developed enough to receive it without damage. The damage, for most of them, was not dramatic. It did not look like the dramatic damage of the kind that fills other stories, the addiction, the spectacular bankruptcy, the complete dissolving of a life. It looked quieter than that, more like a hollow. A low-grade sense of not quite being present in one's own life, of being in a very comfortable room, surrounded by very fine things and feeling somehow that you're watching it from a slight distance. The men in this story closed that distance. Some of them did it with their hands in the literal sense. Some of them did it by giving the money away, by removing the thermostat, so to speak, so that the cold could come in and the fire could be felt. Some of them did both. All of them, in their various ways, decided that the right response to having been given too much was not to manage the surplus carefully, as they had been taught, but to let it go. To feel what remained after the surplus was gone. To discover whether the person underneath the fortune was someone they recognized. Most of them discovered that they were. That stripped of the inherited identity, the name, the house, the expectations, there was still someone there. Someone with preferences and capacities and the particular kind of intelligence that can only be discovered when it is actually required. Someone who could, as it turned out, work. Someone who could, as it turned out, choose. Someone whose presence or absence in the world at the scale at which they now operated made a difference that was small enough to see and large enough to matter. That discovery, the discovery of one's self after the fortune, was for most of them the most valuable thing they ever found. More valuable, many of them said, than the fortune itself, which had been very valuable indeed, but had not been quite the right kind. There is a particular quality of light in large houses at the end of the day. You may have noticed this if you have spent time in very old rooms. The light comes at a low angle and catches the dust in the air, dust that is always there, though usually invisible, and turns it gold for a few minutes. The dust of the room, the dust of the furniture, the dust of the things that have been sitting in the same places for a very long time. And the gold light and the gold dust make the room look for a few minutes like a painting, like a moment preserved, like something that has always been exactly as it is now and will always be. And then the light shifts, and the gold goes out, and you can see the room again. Just a room, with furniture and carpets and paintings, no different in that moment from any other room. That shift, that moment of return from the golden to the ordinary. That, in a way, is what the men in this story were looking for. The moment after the gold light goes out and you can see what is actually there. The ordinary room. The ordinary morning. The ordinary life. The right size. There is a particular quality to the hours between 2 and 4 in the afternoon that anyone who has done manual work for any length of time knows well. The morning's energy is settled. The lunch break has passed. The end of the day is visible but not close. The body has found its rhythm, the particular rhythm of a person in the middle of a shift, past the difficulty of the beginning and before the relief of the end. These hours have a quality of thickness, of the day having weight. This is something the men in this story, the ones who chose the oil fields and the maintenance work and the manual labour of the farm, learned about time. That time has different textures at different hours. That the 2 o'clock of a working afternoon is not the 2 o'clock of a managed day. It sits differently. It moves differently. It costs more to get through, and the getting through it produces something different. Not just tiredness, though that is part of it. Something else. The particular satisfaction of the person who has been doing a thing all day, and is still doing it, and will keep doing it until the whistle blows, or the shift ends, or the light goes. The satisfaction of sustained effort, of showing up in the body through the hours that the body would rather rest. This is a satisfaction that cannot be experienced vicariously. You cannot feel it by reading about it. You cannot feel it by funding the institution where the work is done, or by approving the budget that employs the people who do it. You can only feel it by being in the 2 o'clock of a working afternoon, when the body wants to stop and you keep going anyway, not because you are being heroic, but simply because the work is not done. Winthrop Rockefeller felt this. He felt it in the oil fields of Texas, where the shifts ran 12 hours and the heat was not comfortable, and the drill pipe was not light, and there was no one around him who was going to manage the situation into something more suitable for a man of his background. There was only the work. The 2 o'clock of the work, and the getting through it. And the particular, unglamorous, unspectacular, very real satisfaction of having gotten through it. He said years later that he had been surprised by how much the tiredness helped. Not the tiredness of a managed day, the sort of tiredness that comes from a long series of meetings and decisions and the mental load of many competing responsibilities, but the tiredness of a body that has been genuinely used. Physical tiredness. The tiredness that the Scots call dreich, heavy, persistent, satisfying in the way of a long day of rain after a dry spell. The sleep after a day of physical work is different from the sleep after a day of management. It is deeper, more complete, less troubled by the conversations that were had, and the decisions that were made, and the things that were said and left unsaid, and the whole ongoing narrative of a managed life. The body, genuinely tired, asks for nothing but rest. And the rest is given. And the morning comes, and the work begins again. This rhythmic quality, the tiredness and the rest, and the morning and the work, is something that the men in this story describe as one of the most significant discoveries of the simpler life. Not a grand discovery, not an insight that would change how they understood the world. Just a rhythm. A daily rhythm that made sense. That matched the body's actual needs. That produced, at the end of each day, the clean and simple feeling of something genuinely done. There is something that happens to the mind in the presence of this rhythm that the managed life does not produce. The mind goes quiet, not the quietness of having nothing to think about, not the quietness of boredom, which is its own uncomfortable thing, but the quietness of having the thinking taken over, temporarily, by the body. The quietness that comes when the hands are fully occupied, and the body is fully engaged, and there is simply no surplus capacity for the spinning of the mental wheels. The mental wheels stop. Not because they have been solved, or because the questions have been answered, or because the problems have been resolved, but because there is no room for them just now. The drill pipe is heavy. The floor needs this section next. The cattle have moved to the far pasture. These are the facts of the moment, and they require everything. And while they require everything, the large questions, the questions about meaning and purpose and identity and whether any of this is the right thing, and whether the family would have approved, and whether this is what grandfather would have wanted, go quiet. They do not go away. They will return in the evenings, when the work is done and the body is resting and the mind resets to its ordinary channels. But for the duration of the work, for the particular duration of the 2 o'clock of the working afternoon, they are quiet. And the quiet is its own kind of rest. Even more than the sleep. Even more than the tiredness. The quiet of the mind that is occupied by something real. That is not managing or planning or arranging or deciding. That is just here. Just doing this. Just the drill pipe and the floor and the cattle and the child in the third row who needs the concept explained differently. Just the work. Just the afternoon. Just now. There is a mathematics of enough that is very simple and very rarely taught. It goes like this. Identify what you actually need, not what you might need, or what you could imagine needing, or what the people around you have and which you might one day want. What you actually need today in the life you're actually living. Then acquire that. And stop. This mathematics is simple. It is also, in the context of an economy organized around the perpetual expansion of desire, almost impossible to perform correctly without practice. Because the expansion of desire is the default, the wanting of more, the sense that what you have is insufficient, that the next thing will be the thing that finally completes the picture, is built into the structure of modern commercial life, which depends on dissatisfaction for its engine. Content people are not good consumers. And so the machinery of commercial life works continuously, with extraordinary sophistication and enormous resources to prevent contentment, to convert satisfaction into a new form of dissatisfaction, to replace the just achieved goal with the next goal, slightly further away so that the reaching continues. The men in this story, the ones who chose the small apartment and the economy seat and the plastic bag, had found a way out of this engine. Not through superior virtue, not through asceticism in the punishing sense, but through the simple mathematical discovery that there is a level of material provision below which life becomes uncomfortable and above which it becomes merely complicated. And that the complicated is not better. It is more expensive, more demanding, more requiring of attention and management and the various apparatus of maintaining a certain kind of life. But it is not better. It does not produce more of the things that actually matter. Chuck Feeney's mathematics were explicit. He worked them out with the particular clarity of a man who had started with very little and arrived at a great deal and had thought carefully about both, and he concluded he needed enough to live simply. That amount in his calculation was modest. Everything else was for the work. Everything else was for the work. Not for his comfort, not for the comfort of his image, not for the performance of success, for the work. And the work was the giving. This is the equation. Simple, clear, not comfortable to contemplate if you're invested in the idea that more is always better, but simple. What do you need to do the work? Acquire that. The rest, give it to the work. Winthrop Rockefeller's mathematics were different, because his work was different, but the structure was the same. He needed a farm. The farm required land and animals and the knowledge to manage them. He acquired these things with the specific intentionality of a man who was building something rather than accumulating something. He needed to fund schools and clinics. The schools and clinics required money. He directed money toward them, with the specific intentionality of a man who had worked out what the schools and clinics actually needed and was providing that, not a general surplus of good intentions. He needed for himself enough to live on the mountain in the manner that a working farmer lives. He lived that way. The mathematics of enough. Not the mathematics of more. The mathematics of what is the work and what does the work need and how do I acquire exactly that and not more. This is a radical act of attention. Because attention is scarce, not money which can be multiplied, attention which cannot. Attention is finite. There is a fixed amount of it, and everything you direct it toward is attention taken from somewhere else. The man who is managing a large fortune is directing attention toward the management of the fortune. Every hour of attention directed toward the maintenance of wealth is an hour not directed toward the work. Feeney understood this. He had spent 13 years secretly giving away his fortune while managing, in plain sight, the public face of being a billionaire. He had done this because the legal and logistical realities of the giving required it, because the donation had to be invisible for the foundation to operate as he intended. But he had done it at a cost of attention, and he knew the cost. The moment the secret was out, the moment the court documents revealed that he owned nothing, was not, for Feeney, a moment of crisis. It was a moment of relief. Because now the mathematics could be transparent. Now the attention that had been divided between the giving and the maintenance of the appearance of not giving could be fully given to the giving. He had never been a man who particularly enjoyed managing appearances. The economy seat and the plastic bag and the $15 watch were not calculated image management in reverse. They were not a performance of humility. They were the honest expression of a man who did not see the point of the first-class seat because the first-class seat was not the work. The work was the work. Everything else was not the work. Therefore, everything else should be minimal so that the attention required to maintain it is minimal, so that the attention available for the work is maximal. This is the mathematics of enough. Simple. Radical. Available. Not just to billionaires. Not just to the sons of old money. Available to anyone who is willing to do the arithmetic. To ask, what is the work? What does the work need? What is the minimum necessary for me to live well enough to do the work? And then, acquire that, exactly that, and direct everything else to the work. The work may be different for each person. The work may be the maintenance of a family, or the education of children, or the care of an aging parent, or the building of something that did not exist before. It may be a literal floor in a literal building at 6 a.m. Whatever the work is, the mathematics are the same. What does it need? Acquire that. And stop. And let everything past that point flow toward the work. This is simple. This is enough. This is perhaps all there is. Now we arrive at the most particular part of the story. The part about the janitors. This is not a metaphor. There were, among the sons and grandsons and great-grandsons of American and European old money fortunes, a number of men who became, in the most literal and unceremonious sense, janitors, who pushed mops down corridors, who emptied wastebaskets and cleaned bathrooms and operated floor-polishing machines in office buildings and schools and hospitals, while the people around them, the people who had passed them in hallways every day for months or years, had no idea where they had come from. This is the thing that makes these particular stories unusual, even among the broader category of wealthy men who chose simpler lives. Because there is a range of ways to live simply. You can give away your fortune and live on a farm, as Tolstoy tried to do, and still be surrounded by land and animals and the comforting largeness of a rural life. You can live on a mountaintop in Arkansas, as Winthrop Rockefeller did, and still be a man of evident consequence, still be known, still be the man who owns 900 acres on the mountain. You can fly economy class, as Chuck Feeney did, and still move through the world with the efficiency and purposefulness of a man who has $8 billion to give away. These are real simplifications. They are genuine in their different ways, but they are simplifications that maintain a certain dignity of scale, a certain legibility, the kind of simplicity that is still, in some sense, impressive. The janitor is not impressive. This is the point. This is precisely the point. The janitor occupies the room without being noticed. The janitor is part of the invisible infrastructure of any functioning building. The person who makes the place clean so that the people who matter can work without thinking about cleanliness. The janitor is functional in a way that is unremarkable. And this unremarkability, this being genuinely, unself-consciously, structurally invisible, was something that several men of inherited wealth explicitly sought. Not as penance, not in self-punishment, but as a kind of reset. There is a kind of man who inherits great wealth, and who, For reasons we have been exploring through this night, reasons having to do with the hollow feeling and the floating feeling, and the knowledge that nothing of what surrounds him has been earned, decides that what he needs more than anything else is to become invisible in the most functional sense. To walk into a room carrying a mop and have no one look up. To do a job and have the job be done and have no one know or care who did it. To be, for a period of his life, nobody. Not nobody in the tragic sense, but nobody in the clean, clear, releasing sense of a person who is simply doing the work that is in front of him. One of the most documented of these cases, and we should be careful here, because several of these men requested and received a degree of privacy that their choices were partly designed to produce, involves a man who was the grandson of a significant American industrial fortune, who, in the 1960s, found himself working as a maintenance man in a large building in a medium-sized American city. He had not been forced into this position. He had chosen it. He had, some years before, arranged the transfer of his inherited assets into a set of foundations and trusts, had established a modest income for himself that would sustain an ordinary life, and had then done something that no one in his immediate family could understand. He had applied for a job. Not a senior position, not a management role, not consultancy that would have made use of the business connections and social capital that his name carried. A maintenance job. He showed up on the first morning with the same unremarkable efficiency that he would show up on every subsequent morning for the next several years. He knew where the supply closet was. He knew the schedule. He learned the building's rhythms, which floors were busy in the morning and which in the afternoon, which bathrooms needed attention earliest, which offices could be reached when their occupants were in meetings. He became in time very good at the work. This is worth pausing on. Very good at the work. Not just adequate, not just sufficient. Good. He developed the particular expertise that comes from attending carefully to a thing for a long time, the expertise that looks to outsiders like nothing, because it lives in the avoidance of problems rather than in the solving of them. Clean floors do not attract comment. Wastebaskets that are emptied before they overflow are not noticed. The building functions, and the functioning is invisible, and the invisibility is the sign that the work is done well. He took a quiet pride in this. Not the loud pride of accomplishment, the kind that needs to be shared and witnessed and confirmed. The quiet pride of the person who knows the work is good because they know what good work looks like, and they have been doing it. No one in the building knew where he came from, not from any deception. He had not changed his name, he had not constructed a false history, but simply because no one asked. You do not, as a general rule, ask the maintenance man about his family background. And he did not volunteer. He was for those years exactly what he looked like. A quiet, capable, reliable maintenance man who knew the building well and did his job without drama. He ate his lunch in the lunchroom with the other maintenance staff and the administrative workers and whoever else came through. He drank bad coffee from the machine. He talked about ordinary things, the weather, the parking, the small news of the building. He was, in the way that mattered most to him, at last in the right size of life. There were others. Not all of them chose maintenance work specifically. Some chose factory work, standing at a line, performing the same assembly task for hours, becoming part of the industrial body of a large operation. Some chose agricultural labour, seasonal work on farms, not their own farms, other people's farms, where they were hired hands and nothing more. Some chose construction, which is another kind of skilled manual work that produces visible, solid, irreversible results, a thing built that was not there before. What these choices had in common was not the work itself, but the scale of the relationship to the work. In every case, what was sought was the experience of being necessary in a small and specific way, of having a task that would not be done if you did not do it, of mattering to the immediate situation, here, now, in this room, in this hour, in this very particular way. Not mattering to the family name, not mattering to the arc of a dynasty, not mattering to the endowments and foundations that bore the family's carved-in-stone identity. Just mattering to the cleanliness of this floor, the emptiness of this wastebasket, the smooth running of this machine. And there is, in that small and specific mattering, a kind of satisfaction that no amount of large and general mattering can quite reproduce. There is a passage in the writings of the philosopher and theologian Simone Weil, who was incidentally the daughter of a comfortable French family, and who chose to work in factories in the 1930s as a way of understanding what the industrial working life actually felt like, in which she describes the quality of factory time. She writes about how different it is from the time of the intellectual, or the manager, or the person with freedom to arrange their days. Factory time is not arranged. It is given. The whistle blows and the work begins. The whistle blows again and the work stops. In between, your time is not yours. It belongs to the task, to the machine, to the line. You cannot decide to attend to something more interesting. You cannot redirect your attention. You are here, and the work is here, and that is what there is. She writes about how, initially, this felt like imprisonment, like the loss of everything she valued most about herself, her intelligence, her independence, her capacity for thought. And then how gradually something else happened. How the imprisonment of being fully, completely present to a specific task, with no room for distraction, no possibility of deciding that you would rather be doing something else, was not only imprisonment. It was also, in some degree, relief. The relief of not having to decide what to do next. The relief of the task itself as the answer to the question that otherwise never stops. What should I be doing with my life? This task. This floor. This hour. Now. Several of the men who chose manual work described something similar. The silence of the question while the work was in progress. The way the large, unresolvable questions of meaning and purpose and identity, questions that are very loud in the large houses of old money, in the breakfast rooms with their silver and their quiet, simply go quiet when the work is in your hands. Not answered, quiet. And sometimes that quietness is the best thing available. Sometimes the quietness is enough. There is one story, and this is one of the most private of the stories in this telling, so we will treat it gently, about a young man, the son of a very old American family who worked for almost a decade in a large hospital, in a city where his family's name was on the door of at least one major building. He worked in maintenance. Every day he walked past the building with his family's name on it. Every day he went to the supply closet and got his equipment and began his rounds. Did anyone in the building know? Almost certainly a few people did. The kind of recognition that surfaces eventually over months and years in the particular way a person holds themselves, or the particular quality of their attention, or something in the way they speak that is slightly off, slightly elevated for someone in that position. But if people recognized, they did not speak of it, and he, with the quiet dignity of a man who had made a choice and intended to honor it, did not either. He cleaned the floors of a building that bore his family name. He did not find this humiliating. He found it honest. He found it, in its own strange way, a kind of homecoming, as though the work, unglamorous and unrecognized, was a way of paying a debt that had been accumulating since before he was born, of contributing something real and physical and immediate to the world rather than managing the accumulated evidence of contributions made by people who were no longer alive. He was there. He was doing something. It was visible in the cleanliness of the floor. There is no way to tell this story without acknowledging that it is, in certain obvious ways, a privileged story, that the men in it were choosing difficulty from a position of safety, that they could, at any point, have chosen otherwise, that their poverty, to the extent it was poverty, was voluntary, and therefore not the same thing as the involuntary poverty that most of the people working alongside them had no choice about. This is true, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But it is also true that the choice, even when it is a choice, requires something, that walking past the building with your family's name on it every morning, mop in hand, and doing the work anyway, this is not nothing. It is its own kind of discipline, its own kind of integrity. The wealthy son who becomes a janitor is not the same as the person who has always been a janitor, but he's also not nothing. He's a person who decided against every expectation and every convenience and every social pressure to be present to the world in a way that was not glamorous and not impressive and not in any sense required. He decided to be useful. In the small, specific, daily, unremarkable, floor-level way of the useful. That too is a thing. and it is the particular thing that this night's about. The floors. The early morning hours. The supply closet with its particular smell of cleaning fluid and clean mop. The building waking up around you. The work and the simplicity of the work, and the way the work fills the hours with something real. Let this rest for a moment. Let the image of the man pushing the mop down the corridor with the family name above the door, the corridor that's clean because of the work of a man that no one looks at closely enough to recognize. Let this image sit in the room with you for a moment. It is a gentle image. It is a quiet one. The floor being clean, the work done. The morning coming. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes only from work. Not from studying work, not from observing work, not from managing the people who do the work or funding the institution where the work is done, but from doing the work. With your hands, in your body, over time. The men we have been talking about tonight knew things, after their years of chosen ordinariness, that they could not have known before, and these things are not the kind of knowledge that can be learned from books or acquired through education, however excellent. They are the kind of knowledge that lives in the body. The roughneck knows the weight of drill pipe in a way that the oil company executive cannot. He has lifted it. He has learned to manage the weight, when to let it swing, when to brace against it, how to position his body so that the load is carried by his legs and not his back. This knowledge is in his muscles, it is not theoretical. The janitor knows the smell of a floor before it is clean, and the feel of the mop when the water needs changing. He has a sense, developed over weeks and months of practice, of when the job is done. Not a checklist, a sense. The particular satisfaction of standing back from a stretch of floor and seeing it the way it should be. The farmer knows the soil, not from reading about soil science, though Winthrop Rockefeller read about it too, read about it carefully, but from the physical knowledge of soil that has been worked, the way it feels in your hand when it's right for planting, the way the light falls on it differently when it has been properly turned. These things cannot be administered. They cannot be given by a trust fund or donated by a foundation or accomplished by a board of directors making decisions in a comfortable room. They can only be earned. And this is, in the end, what the men in this story were after. Not just the simplicity of the life, not just the relief from the weight of the fortune, but the specific, irreplaceable, body-based knowledge of a thing done with your own hands. The knowledge that comes from being in the right size of life. Several of these men, the ones who left records, the ones who were eventually willing to talk about their choices, describe a quality that they found in the ordinary life that they had not been able to find in the extraordinary one. The quality of noticing. When you're not managing an empire or overseeing a portfolio or attending to the 1,000 demands of a life arranged at the scale of great wealth, you notice things. You notice the light, not in the aesthetic, appreciative way of someone touring a beautiful place, but in the practical way of someone whose day is shaped by it. The farmer notices when the sky's lightening because there is work to be done, and the light determines when it begins. The maintenance man notices the quality of the fluorescent lights in the corridor because they affect his ability to see whether the floor is clean. The roughneck notices the weather because weather matters to the rig. The noticing is not abstract. It is connected to consequence, to what needs to be done next. And this particular quality of noticing, the noticing that is embedded in the work, that serves the work, that is made necessary by the work, is something that these men describe as one of the most significant gifts of the simpler life. It put them back in the world. Not observing the world from a comfortable height, not appreciating the world from a tastefully arranged distance. In it, actually in it, with the same stake in the weather and the same attention to the light as the people around them who had always been in it. This is a small thing to say about, it is a large thing to feel. There is a specific conversation that was recorded, again, carefully, privately, between two old friends, both of them men who had made significant versions of this choice in their different ways and who were talking about it decades later. One of them said, "I think the thing I understand now that I couldn't have understood before is that most people are genuinely good at things." The other asked what he meant. He said, When you grow up in certain circumstances, you get a certain picture of the world, and the picture is distorted in a specific direction. You see the people who serve you, the staff, the tradespeople, the service workers, and you see their function, their role, what they do for you. And because you see them that way, you miss something essential about them, which is that they are not just filling roles. They are people who are genuinely skilled, genuinely capable, genuinely good at what they do in ways that you, with all your advantages, have never been required to be. He went on, "The cook knows things about food that I will never know. The mechanic knows my car better than I ever will. The woman who cleaned my apartment knew things about cleaning that I did not, and I had been living in apartments my whole life. These people are not simple, they are expert, and I only understood that after I became one of them." This is not in itself a surprising insight. It is the kind of thing that many people arrive at through travel, or through work, or through simply paying attention long enough. The particular intelligence of the person who does a skilled job well is visible to anyone who looks. But the men of old money often could not look because the whole arrangement of their world, the beautiful arrangement, the carefully maintained arrangement, the arrangement that required a great deal of work from a great many people to sustain, was designed, among other things, not to require them to look. The staff was invisible because the staff was supposed to be invisible. The arrangement of old money domestic life was such that what was done for you happened without your having to think about it. The meal was on the table when you sat down. The car was at the door when you came out. The rooms were clean when you returned to them. The machinery of the life ran smoothly and invisibly, and the invisibility was the sign that it was running well. And the men, the boys first and then the men, grew up inside this invisibility. They did not see the cook. They did not see the maintenance man. They did not see the particular expertise and intelligence and daily effort that sustained the comfortable, invisible world they inhabited. Until they became those people themselves. Until they were on the other side of the invisibility. And from that side, everything looked different. Not better or worse, in the simple moral sense that is sometimes applied to stories like this. Different, more real, more complex, more full of the specific, irreducible human expertise that makes any world function. Winthrop Rockefeller, after his years in the oil fields, came back to the world of old money with something he had not had before, a working knowledge of what the people who made the oil wells run actually knew and did and endured. He understood, in a physical sense, the labour that underlay the fortune his grandfather had built. This did not change the fortune, but it changed him. It changed the way he related to the people who worked for him later on the Arkansas farm. It changed the quality of his attention to their lives. He was not a sentimental employer, the old habit of noblesse oblige that treats workers as objects of condescension dressed as kindness. He was something more interesting, a man who respected the expertise of the people around him because he had once held the same tools they held and knew what the holding required. Chuck Feeney, for his part, had come from working-class origins and never lost the working-class sense of what things cost and what they are worth. But his decades of living without the display of wealth, the economy seat, the plastic bag, the small apartment, kept him in proximity to the world that most people inhabit. Not the same proximity as those for whom it was never a choice, but more proximity than the life of a displayed billionaire would have offered. He could sit in the economy seat and talk to the person next to him, and the person next to him would talk back, and the conversation would be the kind of conversation that happens between people who are, in that moment, in the same situation, in the same row, at the same altitude, with the same destination. These are not small things. They are the small things from which understanding is actually built. There is a quality of life, a texture, a grain, that is only available at the ordinary scale. It is available in the morning coffee that you made yourself, with equipment you cleaned yourself, in a kitchen that you keep yourself. It is available in the commute that you take with everyone else, in the weather that affects you as it affects everyone else, in the conversations with people you did not select for their compatible circumstances, but simply encountered because you were in the same place. It is available in the satisfaction, the specific clean satisfaction, of having done a thing yourself, whether that thing is the floor of a building, or the fence on a farm, or the drill pipe on an oil rig. The men in this story found their way to this quality of life by unusual routes, from unusual starting places. Their ordinariness was always, in some sense, chosen. They arrived at the ordinary life with the advantages of education and health, and, if they needed it, in an emergency, the ability to call for help in ways that the genuinely ordinary person cannot. This is the limit of their story, the limit that any honest telling must acknowledge. But within that limit they found something real. Something that their fortune, for all its usefulness in other directions, could not have given them. The floor clean in the early morning. The cattle on the hillside moving through the low autumn light. The grain of a thing known in the hands. The right size. This in the end is what they knew. And it is worth knowing. Not all of the men in this story became janitors or roughnecks or farmers. Some of them stayed in the world they had been born into, living apparently ordinary lives of old money. The dinners, the institutions, the measured generosity of the philanthropist, while secretly doing something else entirely. Something that was not visible from the outside. They were giving the money away. Not in the visible named, building with your name on it way of the conventional philanthropist. In the other way. The way that required the particular courage of not being known for your generosity. The way that Feeney practiced for 13 years, flying economy class while Forbes listed him as a billionaire. The way that, in various less globally scaled versions, a number of other people have practiced in various times and places and ways. There is a word in certain old European languages for this particular practice. In Hebrew it is called tzedakah, a word that is usually translated as charity but that is closer, in its root, to justice. The giving that is done because it is right, not because it is impressive. And within the tradition of tzedakah, as we touched on earlier, the highest form of giving is the anonymous gift, the gift in which neither party knows the other, where the money passes from hand to hand through intermediaries, with no possibility of gratitude or recognition or obligation. This is not just a philosophical nicety, it is a practical statement about what giving is for. Giving that generates recognition is also inevitably generating something for the giver, a feeling of magnanimity, a reputation, a building with a name. These are not nothing, they have their uses, socially and psychologically, but they are not the same as giving. Giving that generates nothing for the giver, giving that asks for no recognition, that attaches no name, that produces no legacy except the thing funded, is a different act. It is an act of pure removal, of taking the surplus and moving it without drama to where it is needed. And the men who did this, who arranged their giving so carefully and so quietly that no one around them knew what was happening, occupied a strange position in the world. They were, in the technical sense of the word, philanthropists. But they were invisible philanthropists, philanthropists without the theatre of philanthropy. There is something restful about the idea of giving without theatre. In a world where most generosity is performed, where the donation is announced and the plaque is installed and the grateful institution sends letters on headed paper, the unglamorous giving has a particular quality. It is like the work of the janitor in a different register, the work that makes the world function, that is not looked at, that is simply done. The school is funded, the clinic has equipment, the scholarship is awarded, the student goes to university who would not otherwise have gone. And somewhere in the city, a person with an old name and a trust account walks past a building that exists partly because of money that once bore his name, and no one in the building knows, and he does not tell them, and the building is full of people doing the work that buildings are supposed to support. This is enough. It is more than enough. There was a man, we will call him Thomas, because this story was told to me at some remove and the name is not the important thing, who was the son of a family that had made its fortune in the textile industry in the late 19th century. Not one of the great fortunes, not a Rockefeller or a Vanderbilt, but substantial, enough to support the family across several generations in the comfortable, well-appointed, quietly unremarkable way of secondary old money. The kind of money that does not make the newspapers, but that keeps the houses warm and the children at the right schools and the summer place maintained. Thomas grew up in that kind of warmth and unremarkability. He was a quiet boy, thoughtful. He read a great deal. He was good at school without being exceptional at school. He went to the expected university and studied the expected subjects, and came home and entered the family firm, which was not exactly a firm by then. The textile mills had long been sold, and what remained was a set of investments managed by a family office on a quiet street in a medium-sized American city. He worked in the family office for a few years. He did not find it satisfying. He was good at the management in the dutiful way of someone who's been raised to be responsible. He attended the meetings, he read the reports, he made the decisions that the investments required. But none of it, not one day of it, felt necessary. In his late 30s, Thomas did something that puzzled everyone around him. He took a job. Not a job in finance, not a job in any sector where his background and his name would have opened doors. He took a job as a middle school teacher in a public school in a poor neighbourhood of the city where his family had always lived. He taught history. He was, after the first difficult year, the year of learning how classrooms actually work, which is not something that any amount of reading about education quite prepares you for, good at it. He was there for 12 years. During those 12 years, he also, quietly and without announcement, transferred significant portions of the family assets to a foundation that funded teacher training programs and school supplies and after-school programs in the kind of neighbourhoods where he was working. No one at the school knew. Not because he was hiding exactly, because it never came up, because the subject of family wealth is not one that middle school teachers discuss over their lunch breaks in the staff room, and Thomas was not inclined to introduce it. He was the history teacher. He was good at it. His students learned things. His subject, history, the long story of what human beings have done and been and suffered and built and lost, was one that he came to with a particular perspective, given his own background. He knew, from living it, that the way history is told is almost always the story of the powerful, the wealthy, the people whose names end up on buildings. He tried to teach, alongside that story, the other story, the invisible story, the story of the people who did the work that made the buildings possible, the servants, the labourers, the workers, the people whose names are not on anything but whose hands shaped everything. He knew something about that, having come from one side of the line and chosen to live on the other. His students, most of whom had never been anywhere near the first side of the line, found his teaching unusually honest. Teachers who acknowledge the actual complexity of history, who do not simply narrate triumph but also cost, do not simply celebrate builders without asking what was built on, tend to produce students who ask better questions. Thomas produced students who asked very good questions. He did not find this work less important than managing a portfolio. He found it more important. Not because it was heroic. It was not heroic. It was ordinary, daily, grinding work in the way that all good teaching is ordinary, daily, grinding work. The preparation, the grading, the particular exhaustion of being fully present, mentally and emotionally, for 30 young people for 6 hours a day. The nights of planning and the mornings of wondering whether the day's lesson was good enough. All of that was real. And all of it was his. Not inherited, not arranged by a trust document, not provided by the accumulated decisions of people who were no longer alive. His. Because he had chosen it. And the choosing, the repeated, daily, available to be otherwise choosing to show up, gave it a quality that the inherited life had never quite had. The quality of having actually been decided. There are, in the broader category of stories we have been telling tonight, certain recurring elements that are worth naming, because they point to something underneath all the specific choices and all the particular personalities. The men in these stories, Winthrop in the oil fields, Feeney in the economy seat, Thomas in the middle school classroom, the nameless men with the mops, all found something similar in the simpler life. They found that they mattered to the immediate situation. Not to history, not to their family name, not to the broad, diffuse, hard-to-verify project of improving the world through the careful management of a large fortune, to the immediate situation. The drill pipe is heavy. You're needed here, now, to manage your end of it. The clinic is open. You're needed here, now, to make sure the equipment works. The floor is dirty. You're needed here now to clean it. The student in the third row is confused about the causes of the Civil War. You're needed here, now, to explain it better. Now.
Here.
This is the quality that the enormous life, the life arranged around a great fortune, cannot provide in the same way. Because the enormous life operates at a scale where the immediate situation is always being managed by someone else, where the now is always slightly abstracted, where the here is always mediated by staff and lawyers and the elaborate apparatus of managing large assets. The small life, the life that fits in a bunkhouse or a rented apartment or a middle school classroom, has a directness that the large life cannot. And directness, it turns out, is what several of these men had been missing. The feeling of being directly necessary, of being needed right here, right now, in a way that does not require their name or their fortune to be the reason. Just their presence, their specific attention, their hands. There is one more element of the secret giving that deserves mention before we move on. The element of continuity. Some of the men who chose simpler lives, and who arranged their fortunes to flow elsewhere, described a specific relief in doing so. Not just the relief of simplification, or the relief of directness, but the relief of a particular kind of continuity. They described feeling after the giving was arranged as though they were finally in the correct relationship to time. The fortune, managed and maintained, was always pulling toward the past, toward the decisions of the founding generation, toward the original source of the wealth, toward the question of what grandfather would have thought. The fortune was always a conversation with people who were no longer alive, always a negotiation with a history that you had no part in creating. The simple life, the earned life, the work that was yours because you had chosen it and were doing it, was entirely in the present. The floor is dirty now. The student is confused now. The cattle need to be checked now. There is nowhere else to be but here, and the here is entirely yours, entirely chosen, entirely the result of your own decisions about what your life is for. This quality of being entirely in the present, because the present is where the work is something that contemplative traditions across the world have described as one of the central goods of a simple life. Not the poverty itself. The monks and sages were not recommending that everyone become poor, but the simplicity that comes from having reduced the number of things that pull you away from where you actually are. The fortune pulls you away. It pulls you toward the past that created it, and the future that must preserve it. It pulls you into the planning and the management and the arrangements that a large complicated asset always requires. It pulls you, in short, away from now. And now is where the work is. The oil fields at 7 in the morning. The school at 8. The hospital corridor at 6. The farm at dawn, when the animals need attention regardless of what else is happening anywhere else in the world. Now. Here. The right size. And the night grows a little quieter. And the floor is clean. And the cattle are settled. And the work is done for today. There is a question that is worth sitting with, as the night deepens and the stories settle. What did they leave behind? Not in the practical sense, the foundations, the funded buildings, the gifts recorded in the archives of universities and hospitals across the world. Those things are real, and they matter, and they can be documented by anyone who cares to look. But in the other sense, what did they leave in the world that does not appear in the accounts? What is the remainder, after the arithmetic of fortune given and fortune received, after the ledger of the giving and the names of the institutions and the dry, careful language of the charitable bequest? The remainder is harder to describe, but it is in some ways the most interesting part. There is a school in a small county in Arkansas, a good school, a school that was built with money that came from a man who had grown up in New York in a family of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary social obligation, and who had decided in his early 50s to go live on a mountain and raise cattle. The school exists. The children who went to that school learned things. Some of them are alive now. Some of their children are alive. Some of their grandchildren. None of them probably know the name of the man who funded the school. The name of the school is not the name of the man. The school simply exists, in the way that good things simply exist when they have been placed in the world by someone who did not need the recognition. This is the particular kind of remainder that the secret givers leave. Not monuments, not named buildings, just things that are there, that work, that make a difference, that would not be there without the gift. The school is full. The clinic has equipment. The scholarship has been awarded. The student is right now somewhere in the world doing the work that the scholarship made possible. And none of it has a face attached. None of it has a plaque. It is simply there. There is a phrase that Tolstoy used in one of his later essays about what he wanted his life to have accomplished. He said he wanted to have been, in some small way, good. Not great, not important, not remembered. Good. In the quiet, daily, doing the work in front of you sense of the word. Good in the way that a clean floor is good, in the way that a well-made boot is good, in the way that a field properly turned is good, in the way that a student who understands something at the end of a lesson is good. He did not fully achieve this because no one fully achieves it. His life was complicated and his family was unhappy and his ideals were larger than his capacity to live them perfectly. But the aspiration was real. And the aspiration points at something that the men in this story were all, in their different ways, oriented toward. The aspiration toward the ordinary good. The good that is not spectacular. That does not require a large stage or an announcement or a name above the door. The good that is simply the work done well. The floor that is clean. The cattle that are healthy. The student who understands. The patient who receives treatment that works. The good that is made of small things, added up over time, quietly, without ceremony. This is worth thinking about as we rest here in the later hours of the night. Because it's not only for the sons of old money. This particular aspiration, toward the ordinary good, toward the right size of life, toward being useful in the immediate and specific sense, is not something that requires a fortune to give away. It is available in much smaller doses. It is available in the choice to do the work in front of you as well as you can do it. In the choice to be present to the situation you're actually in, rather than the situation you might prefer to be in. In the choice to offer what you genuinely have, rather than performing what you wish you had. The janitor with the mop and the man who inherited a fortune and chose the mop are, in one sense, in entirely different situations. In another sense, they are doing exactly the same thing. They are cleaning the floor. And the floor afterward is clean. This is the commonality that runs beneath all the biographical difference. The son of old money who chose the simple life and the person who was born into the simple life and had no other choice are not in the same situation. But they can be doing the same work, with the same care, for the same immediate and concrete and floor-level reason. Because the floor needs cleaning. Now, here, that commonality, that particular human equality available in the doing of necessary work, was something that several of these men described as one of the most unexpected gifts of the choice they had made. Not that wealth and poverty were the same. They were not. But that the work was the same. That the floor, wherever you find yourself, in whatever life you have arrived at by whatever combination of accident and choice, requires the same attention and the same care and the same genuine doing. And that the doing is the same, whoever does it. There is something that happens in the later stages of these stories, in the final years of the men we have been following through this night, that is worth attending to. Something that several of them described in various ways as a kind of settling. Not peace exactly, or not only peace, but a particular quality of ease that comes from having arrived at the right relationship with your own life, from having arranged things so that the daily structure of your existence corresponds, at last, to the daily structure of your values. The fortune had always been slightly misaligned with who they were. Not wrong, in any obvious way. Not a curse, not a burden in the dramatic sense, but slightly off, like a picture hung not quite straight. You can live with it for years. You can tell yourself you don't notice. But the slight wrongness is always there, in the periphery, available to be seen if you turn toward it directly. Giving it away, or choosing to inhabit it differently, or going to work with your hands in a way that was not required, straightened the picture. and in the straightened picture, a new kind of ease became available. Winthrop Rockefeller, in his later years on the Arkansas mountain, talked about his cattle in a way that surprised people who expected him to talk about bigger things, about the political situation, about the family legacy, about the great questions of his era, to which his name seemed to grant him some access. He talked about his cattle, about the particular quality of the Santa Gertrudis breed, their toughness and their adaptability, about the land on the mountain, what it could and could not do, about the people who worked with him, what they knew, what they had taught him. He talked, in other words, about his life. The actual life as it was actually lived on the mountain with the animals, with the work. Not the life as a footnote to a larger history. Just the life. And in the talking about it you could hear the settling. The quality of a man who had arrived, after considerable distance and difficulty, at the right place. Not the place that anyone had expected him to be. The right place. Chuck Feeney, in the last years before he closed Atlantic Philanthropies in 2020, was asked by a journalist how he felt about what he had done, about having given away $8 billion. He thought about it for a moment. He said, "We did it, we finished it, I feel very good about that." Simple sentences. We did it. We finished it. I feel very good about that. Not the language of the grand gesture, not the language of the historic achievement, the language of a man who set out to do a job and completed it, and is, in the straightforward way of someone who has finished a day's work, satisfied. We did it. The floor is clean. The work is done. I feel very good about that. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that only completed work produces, not the work that is ongoing, that stretches into a future that cannot be seen, but the work that is done, the task that is finished, the thing that exists, that is complete, that is there. Feeney had that. After 89 years of living, 40 some of them spent in the particular labour of giving a fortune away as carefully and as wisely as he could, he had that. The completeness. The doneness. The rightness of a thing that was the right thing, and that he had done it. He was living in a small rented apartment. He had no property. He owned almost nothing. He felt very good about that. This is the thing that is hardest to explain to people who have not arrived at it. That the less can be more, not as a slogan, not as a comforting simplification, as an actual experienced quality of a life lived at the right scale. The small apartment that you can understand entirely, the routines that are simple enough to be present in, rather than too complicated to do anything but manage, the work that is concrete enough to see when it is done. The right size. We have spent this night moving through the lives of men who were born into extraordinary circumstances, and who chose, for different reasons, through different paths, at different moments in their lives, to inhabit smaller ones. We have sat with Tolstoy at his writing desk with the scythe leaning against the wall. We have stood with a young Winthrop Rockefeller in the Texas oil fields, learning the weight of drill pipe. We have followed Chuck Feeney through decades of economy seats and plastic bags and the extraordinary invisible labour of giving $8 billion away before anyone knew he had it. We have walked the corridors of the building with the family name above the door, beside the man who cleaned those corridors without anyone knowing why he had chosen to be there. We have sat in the middle school classroom where the history teacher explains, with unusual honesty, the difference between the story of power and the story of the people who made power possible. All of these men, in their different ways, through their different choices, and were looking for the same thing. The ordinary life. The right size. The work that is yours because you have chosen it and are doing it and can see the result of it, clean and real and there. This is not a small thing to have found. It is, in fact, one of the larger things available. But it is only available at the smaller scale. Only at the scale where you can see it from where you stand. Only at the scale where the work is in your hands, and the hands are yours, and the result is visible from here. There is no returning. This is something that the men in this story understood, in the final accounting of their choices. They did not return to the large houses and the silver and the arrangements that had been there before. They could not. Not because the houses were not still standing, some of them were, but because the person who would have lived in them was no longer quite there. The oil fields had changed Winthrop. The economy seat had changed Feeney. The mop had changed whoever held it. And once you have been changed in that particular way, once you have held the drill pipe and felt the weight, once you have pushed the mop through the 2 o'clock of a working afternoon, once you have come off a shift genuinely tired in the way that earns sleep, you cannot unfeel those things. You cannot return to the large house and sit at the breakfast table as though you have not been in the mud. Not because you cannot enjoy the large house, many of these men continue to inhabit comfortable circumstances, but because you know now, in a way you could not know before, what the house costs, what it takes to sustain it, whose work goes into the making of the world that the large house sits inside. You know because you did some of that work. You held a small piece of the enormous invisible weight that keeps everything functioning. And having held it, having felt its specific heaviness in your actual hands, you cannot quite pretend you never knew. This is the other side of what the men in this story found. Not just the pleasure of the simpler life. Not just the satisfaction of the right-sized room and the rhythm of the work and the quiet of the mind that is occupied by something real. But the knowledge. The specific, embodied, hands-on knowledge of how the world actually works. Not in the grand economic sense. Not the knowledge of supply chains and labour markets and the theoretical underpinning of industrial capitalism, but in the immediate personal physical sense of knowing what it costs to make a floor clean. This knowledge is not something you can read. It is not something you can learn by watching. It is not something that can be communicated in a trust document or encoded in a foundation's charter. It lives in the hands. And having lived in the hands, it changes what the hands do next. Many of the men who made these choices, who went to the oil fields or the hospital corridor or the middle school classroom, described coming back from those experiences with a fundamentally different understanding of the people around them. Not a sentimental understanding, not the patronizing kind of understanding that romanticizes the working life from a comfortable distance, but a functional, practical, specific understanding of what expertise looks like in the people who do the work that the world runs on. Winthrop Rockefeller, after his years in the oil fields, could look at an oil worker and understand, in a specific and not general way, what that person knew and could do. He could recognize competence. He could distinguish between the person who was managing the drill pipe well and the person who was struggling with it. He had a vocabulary, not the vocabulary of the manager reading reports, but the vocabulary of the person who had done the work. This changed how he employed people, changed how he talked to them, changed what he noticed about them, changed the quality of his attention to the lives of the people who worked on his farm in Arkansas, because he was not attending to abstractions. He was attending to people whose work he understood, because he had done some version of it. This is the surplus value of the chosen ordinary life, the thing it produces beyond the personal satisfaction of the person who chooses it. It produces knowledge. Specific, transferable, relationship-changing knowledge of what other lives cost. And knowledge of what other lives cost tends to produce, in people who are honest enough to feel it, a change in what those people do with whatever they have left to give. The school in Arkansas. The clinic with the equipment. The scholarship. The peace process. These things exist in part because the men who funded them knew what it cost to live without them. Not in theory. In the hands. In the 2 o'clock of the working afternoon. In the specific weight of necessary work done in the body over time. And that knowledge, that embodied hands-on shift-length knowledge, is the thing that transformed the giving from management into understanding. From the endowment of a building to the funding of a thing that actually worked. Because you cannot fund a thing that actually works unless you know from somewhere in your experience what working actually looks like. What it requires. What it costs. What happens when it is done right. What the people who do it need in order to do it well. You learn this in the oil field. In the hospital corridor at 6 a.m. In the middle school classroom on a Tuesday afternoon when the lesson is not going as planned and you have to find a different way. You learn it in the body. And the learning stays. And what stays changes what you give. and what you give changes what exists. And what exists is the school, and the clinic, and the building full of people doing the work, and the clean floor, and the morning coming, always available, regardless of what has come before, the morning, the work, the right size of a life. You are allowed to rest in that, to let the stories settle around you, to let the night hold you. The large house is far away. The breakfast table with its silver is not your concern. The lawn going green to the stone wall is not yours to manage. All you have is here. This, the quiet, the dark, the breath, the particular stillness of a night that has been well told. The work is done for tonight. You can rest now. Let it be enough. It is enough. The floor is clean. The cattle are settled. The student understands. The building is full. The $8 billion is given and done and out in the world doing what it was meant to do. And the man who gave it is in his small apartment, in the quiet that is the right quiet, in the right size of a life that is exactly his. Resting. As you can rest now. In the right size of this night. This breathing. This quiet. This enough. The stories we have told tonight are settling now. Like the last of the lights settling over a field at the end of a long working day. Like the quiet that comes into a building after the last person has gone and the doors have been locked and the work is done. Tolstoy is at his desk in the study at Yasnaya Polyana. The scythe leans against the wall. The saw, the manuscript on the desk, and the tools beside it, and the window looking out across the estate where the fields have been ploughed today, and the fields will need ploughing again tomorrow. But for now the lamp, the desk, the quiet. Winthrop is on his mountain in Arkansas. The cattle are in the pasture, moving slowly in the late light. The farmhands have gone home. The farm is his, in the only sense that actually mattered to him, in the sense that it exists because of work that was genuinely done, that produces something that is genuinely good, that he can see from where he stands. He is content. Not in the comfortable house, soft light, everything arranged way of the life he left. In the specific way of a man who has done something real. Chuck Feeney is in his apartment in San Francisco. The foundation is closed. The money is gone. The $8 billion that passed through his hands over 40 years has found its destinations, the schools and hospitals and universities and peace negotiations, and has become buildings and programs and trained doctors and educated children and the particular, unmeasurable ongoing thing that happens when the right resources reach the right places at the right time. He's 89 years old. He feels he says very good about that. The maintenance man is going home after the early shift. The building is clean. The corridors are prepared for the day that's about to begin. He was there. He did the work. It is enough. And somewhere, in the quiet of a city still waking up, in the particular stillness of a building that has been prepared and waits, the morning is arriving. As it always does, as it always will. The morning does not know the name above the door. The morning comes equally to the prepared building and the unprepared building. To the building with the famous name and the building with no name. To the man who inherited everything and gave it away. To the man who was born without and worked for all of it. To all of them, in their different rooms, in their different right-sized lives. The morning comes. The light comes in at its particular angle, depending on which way the window faces, depending on what time of year it is, depending on whether there are clouds. The light is just light. It does not distinguish. It finds the floor, clean or not clean, the desk, with the manuscript or without, the tools leaning against the wall or not leaning there. The morning is the morning. And you are here in it. In whatever size of life is yours. In whatever work is in front of you. In whatever room you inhabit. The morning comes. Let it come. Let it find you resting. Let the stories rest with you. The roughneck and the count and the janitor and the man with the economy seat. All of them in the end doing the same thing. Being here. In the work. In the morning. In the right size. Rest now. The night is long and the stories are done, and the morning when it comes will be its own. Sleep. We return now to the large house. The house with the thick carpets and the paintings in their heavy frames and the silver on the sideboard that has belonged to the family for longer than anyone alive can remember. The early morning light is coming in through the east-facing windows. The lawn is green. The clock in the hallway is winding itself, as it has always wound itself, keeping the time of a house that moves more slowly than the world outside it. But the breakfast table is empty. The young man who sat there, who looked out at the lawn and thought about leaving, who felt the hollow feeling, who wondered what it would be like to be in the right size of life, he has gone. He has been gone for a long time now. Where he went, what he found, what he left behind, the floor that is clean, the school that exists, the building full of people doing the work that needs to be done, these things are real. They are there, in the world, whether or not anyone knows who put them there. The silver catches the morning light. The clock winds on. And somewhere, far from this house, in a place that is modest and appropriate and exactly the right size, a man who inherited more than he needed wakes up early and goes to work. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. Did you grow up knowing any families like the ones in this story? Families with old money, or families who chose to live simply despite having more? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. Before we close entirely, there is something worth saying plainly. This story is not an argument against wealth. It is not a sermon about the sin of having things. It is not a call for everyone to put down what they have and go to work in the fields. The men in this story were extraordinary in their choices, and the extraordinariness of their choices is part of what makes them worth telling. Most people who inherit great wealth do not give it away. Most people who have comfortable lives do not seek out discomfort for its own sake. Nor should they necessarily. What these men found was particular to them, at the particular intersections of their personalities and their circumstances, and the specific questions they arrived at by their own roots. Their answers were their answers. What belongs to all of us, the thing that carries across the biographical difference, is the question. The question about whether the life we are living fits the person we actually are. Whether the size we inhabit is the right size. Whether the work we do is genuinely ours, or inherited, or arranged, or performed. Whether we are here, actually here in the body, in the place, in the moment, or whether we are floating a little above it, managing it from a comfortable height. These questions are not the property of the wealthy. They are available to anyone with enough quiet to hear them, and enough honesty to take them seriously. The man with the mop was looking for the same thing as the man who left the estate to plough the field. The same thing as the man in the economy seat. The same thing that everyone at some level is looking for. The feeling of being genuinely present. Of being actually here. Of doing the work that is actually yours. Of living in the right size of a life that fits. That is what this night has been about. Not the fortunes. Not the giving. Not even the extraordinary choices these extraordinary men made. But the question underneath all of it. The question that makes the floor worth cleaning. The question that makes the morning worth rising for. The question that holds the day together and gives the work its meaning. Am I here? Am I doing this? Is this mine? Yes. 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 Rest now. The light in the east window is beginning, pale and unhurried. The lawn is still green, the house is still. The day will begin when you are ready. For now, sleep. Sleep well. The work will be there in the morning.